This is the Portland Planning Sustainability Commission May 28th meeting. Today on our agenda, we have called order of business, and items of interest from commissioners. We'll have a consent agenda of 2 items, the meeting minutes from the 5/7 meeting and street vacation. If any commissioners have read that and have any issues, let me know before that one. And then we'll have a continued work session on West Hayden Island draft plan. We will not be voting on the West Hayden Island plan today. Just to clarify, it's just work session about what the final plan that we do vote on July 9th is contains. With that, items of interest from the commissioners. Anything? Susan? Nope. Consent agenda is consideration of minutes from May 7th meeting and right-of-way request 7561, request for street vacation of Southwest Grover Street. Is there a motion?
Move adoption of the consent agenda.
And I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
It's been approved. The next item is the West Hayden Island draft plan. And I'm just going to go through, we have kind of 4 stages today. The first stage is item 1, and this is on the back of your packet. If you turn to the second page of the packet that they sent. The first part is you have the packet of recommendations that staff has had. What I'd like to do is treat that as an entirety, but if you have amendments, you want to pull something out, let us know, and we will just pull that out. And we're just going to keep going. We will put that in item 4 and come back to those and address them individually. But at the end of this process for item 1, I'd like to just know whether everybody's comfortable with the amendments, the language that you don't have a problem with, and then that will be included in the final proposal that we vote on July 9th. The second item is the force proposal. 2 options before us, the 110% or 101%. The third item is the floodplain, and we'll look at those 2 options. And then the fourth are any additional amendments you want to the West Hayden Island or items that you've pulled out from item 1, and we will address those at that time, and then take those one by one or as a total and see where we are. That is on the initial memo. Do we have any extra of these, Julie, with a back memo?
We have abbreviated ones in the back.
Oh, okay. So, Eric, you want to get started?
Sure. Thank you. My name's Eric Engstrom with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, for the record. Chair Bob just described the staff recommended order of operations today, so I don't have to redo that, but just a few thoughts to remind you what the agenda here is basically to get us the information that we need so that we can prepare the final version as amended from your discussion for your consideration at the July meeting. So we'll go through that sequence. As Chair Ba indicated, the intent is not to do a vote on the final package tonight, but give us enough information so we can go get that ready for you. As you talk about these items, keep in mind that there could be discussion around just intent or clarification that's separate from amendment, and we're happy to do that. But to have clarity about what you're actually asking to amend, probably the thing to do would be to keep the discussion to the items 2, 3, and 4, and if there's anything that's not clear or needs clarification in the, essentially what would be the kind of the consent agenda in number 1, to pull those items so we can talk about them. Are there any questions just about the structure of the material you have in front of you? The thing you'll probably want to keep on top is attachment, aside from the agenda that Andre just went over, the attachment A is essentially a list of the individual amendments recommended by staff, which is essentially item number 1, unless you pull things from it. So as you're talking about that, if you refer to the item numbers, that will allow us to keep track. And then attachments B and C correspond to items 2 and 3 in the agenda, just so you can keep that straight. Is that all clear? So if there aren't any questions about that, then I think what we're doing is starting with a discussion of whether there's anything in attachment A that you're not comfortable with or you want further discussion of, and we should just be itemizing those and moving them down into agenda number 4.
So we're just going to go around and try to collect everybody at once. So let's, Gary, do you have any, let's just go around. Gary, do you have any amendments or clarifications you want to make at this time?
No, not at this point.
Okay. Chris?
So I'd like to call out item 73, which is the so-called off-ramp language. Not that I necessarily disagree with it, but I'd like to have a discussion, make sure I understand it thoroughly before I give my head nod to it. So if we could pull that out for discussion, that'd be great.
Okay.
Howard?
No, nothing but attachment A.
Catherine?
No.
7.3 and 7.5. 7.3 and 7.5.
I don't have any point numbers, so are you looking at the same attachment?
Oh. Oops. Well, I was referring to the same point Chris raised regarding the,
So it's 75, not 7.5, right?
okay,
75?
got it. Sorry, I transposed the decimal. 73 and 75.
Okay.
Thank you.
73 and 75. I just would like clarification on 41. '69, and I believe 69 has some other connections in there too. That's it. Don?
I don't know if I'm saying this at the right time or in reference to the correct document, but I'd still like to get some, have a little more dialogue around floodplain to inform myself. I'd like to have dialogue around 110% versus 101%. And I'd like to have dialogue around the proposed park and recreation plan, both on-site and off-site.
So we have the
I think that would
floodplain,
be,
the floodplain
That's coming up.
and the forest are on item 2 and 3, but the parks are not.
and I guess you could just bring the parks into the item 4.
Item 4, yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other items in section A? So we're all comfortable with the remaining items in section A? Okay.
Comfortable may not be the exact word. Willing
This is
let
going
it
to be
slide.
the final, so
Okay.
attachment B.
Okay, so then the attachment B is the forest proposal, and the options you have in front of you are to retain the 101% benchmark, which was in our last draft, or to revert to 110% benchmark. And this is a performance standard related to how much forest mitigation is enough. And the specific language that staff's proposed is in attachment B. And so it's essentially a replacement of a section of the IGA with some revised language.
So we have two options.
Two options, either keeping the old language or going with this language. And the difference substantively is that we believe this new language would aim for the 110% mark. And to do that, you have to add a third site into consideration, because somewhere between 101 and 110, you run out of opportunity on Government Island and West Hayden Island. We've essentially structured that option similar to the way we structured it in the previous winter 2012 proposal, where there was an option to pay that extra difference out to a fund.
Okay.
And what's our procedure? Do we?
Well,
Get something
just discussion on this, and then we need to, we'll just go around, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think just for clarity, it would be really helpful to have a vote on each one of
Yeah.
the sections, because we don't want people to come back later and say, well, I didn't really agree, or I didn't, I think it'll just make it more clear if we can do that.
So I
after
was
each
going to
one.
move that we adopt 2B.
And-
110.
Correct.
Second for the purposes of discussion.
Okay.
That's the,
Been
that's
moved
the
in
purpose.
second. Can we have some discussion on the 110?
Well, I'll start out by simply saying we had a very abbreviated conversation about this issue 2 or 3 work sessions, hearings ago. And I believe that we really did not discuss this issue in great depth, that there was just kind of a shrug and how do you tell 101 versus 110? We know we want a net ecological lift, but what's the difference between 100 and 110? And I think staff has, in fact, provided us with that information to make an informed decision. And based on the testimony we received, I would concur.
Chris?
So I agree that 101 is cutting it awfully close to the margin if we want to say that we're increasing the ecosystem function. I guess the question I have is are there really just two choices, or are there a set of choices that could be, at 105, 106 that might have different dollar values, or is it as soon as we go to a third site, we're immediately at the higher price range? Is there anything in between, or are these the only two choices?
I think the way I'd answer that is somewhere around 104% or so is when you shift to the other site. So you could inch your way up slightly without going to the second site, but at some point you just run out of clearings on Government Island and West Hayden Island to plant new forest, and that's essentially the issue, is unless you convert other habitat to forest. And then the cost really at that point is uncertainty about the purchase of the property that you'd need and whether you, so it's still, staff is reflecting it as a range of 1 to 4 million because we don't really know the
Okay, so
property
that's about the
cost.
purchase price. Okay. So the port could go buy an option tomorrow and make that more certain, right?
Or it could be a minimal difference if they're utilizing property that's already in their possession or in some other public entity's possession.
A third site hasn't been identified.
We've done some cost estimates using a proxy on Sauvie Island that happens to be a property that was available at the time we were starting to do this work. And we've also looked at some other options involving other city property at various times. So there are other sites that could be used for this. We haven't nailed it down to one or the other.
It's not purely imaginary, you've got some comparables.
Right.
Gary?
A question on the metrics. When you're looking at the 110 versus 101, to what extent do those metrics incorporate the breaking up of a single forested area, for example, into multiple areas? Is that accounted for in the metric, or is it If you just add up all of the pieces, do you get to 101?
The way that it would be accounted for is there's a set of ratios that are applied to represent different factors of mitigation. One is a multiplier, so it's not just 1-to-1, it's many times over 1-to-1 based on adding factors in. And one factor is the time lag between mitigation and planting and impact. Another is the distance from site. Another is the whether you're doing restoration or enhancement or new plantings. And then we've limited in the IGA, I believe the IGA said that it would be no more than 3 sites, in part to control for that issue.
So you would argue that the consideration of distance and the disintegration of the ecosystem is inherent in the metric?
I think so. It doesn't explicitly call it out, but part of the rationale for selecting Government Island as one of the receiving sites is that the end result is a large contiguous piece of forest when you combine it with what's already there. But no, it's not explicitly, there's not a multiplier in the math, if that's what you're asking.
Don, did you have a comment?
Oh, I will. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Commissioner Oxman just raised the most central point in both the floodplain mitigation and the forest mitigation. That is, we're going from one intact 800-acre site to smaller sites, and that is precisely why so many people have testified about this being an irreplaceable resource. It's the size that you start with, and the sum of the parts is not necessarily greater than the whole in this case. So that is the concern, which is the reason why, if we're going to err, in my opinion, we should be erring toward some more mitigation in this case.
Don, do you?
Yeah, I don't agree with 110%. I agree with 101%. It meets the requirement, and it does it in a very coherent way on 2 locations with 2 very specific approaches on Hayden Island and Government Island. And I don't see why we need to boost it to 110. I really don't. I've listened to everything. I've read everything. I'm a 101 person in 2 locations that are very cohesive.
The question, go ahead, Chris, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Don a question about his position. So one of the Fish and Wildlife agencies, I forget if it was federal or state, suggested that because of the uncertainty in what you're going to achieve, 101 is only an estimate, right? We're going to be a little more or a little less. That because of the uncertainty, we should actually shoot for 125 to have confidence that we're going to increase the ecosystem function. So my question would be, if we're targeting 101 with some error bars on either side, how can we feel confident we're going to achieve net ecosystem increase?
I don't know if we can feel completely confident. It's not a precise science, although I agree with all the methodology used to kind of compute the mitigation. We don't know how it's going to perform until it's completed in the field, Chris. And, I would say, I don't think it's going to drop down to 75% of what our objective is if there's a good maintenance program over 30 years and good monitoring on an annual basis as I read it. I think 101 is adequate.
My question is something similar to Chris, but in a different way. Is the third needed at any situation to reach the 101? So is there a third site needed in any of the calculation that would be needed to reach 101?
You could use other sites. We've not recommended that. So there's enough opportunity on West Hidden Island and Government Island to meet the requirement with those 2.
So given the margin of error and given, and I remember the discussion about you should shoot almost 25% more to reach basically 100% because of the unknown certainty is that, I mean, if I look at this, then you potentially could get 75% on the two, and would we need to go to a third to get to the 101? And that is kind of my question.
Well, if you're
I mean, if
if you're
is there that
discounting
much
everything by a
margin?
quarter to assert additional uncertainty, yes, you would need to go to a third site. If you adopted that as your methodology. That wasn't staff's methodology, but that.
Well,
I would hope our methodology has a better.
Well, I'm trying to
25%
get to why
curve.
there was such a large margin on the one side from the agency of, you know, you had to overshoot to get to 100%. And if you do, it theoretically, they're assuming you're going to be undershooting by a certain percentage. And so if you have to get out to a third site,
Commissioner, I think one of the issues here is that we're looking at, if you want to be 100% sure, then you're going to go with just the technical science. And I think that's what they came in with in terms of saying 125% to make absolutely sure. Somewhere in there is kind of diminishing returns and the costs. And looking at some point in there, to get 100% surety, it costs a lot more for that last little bit than it does to get to the 101. And so that's where we came back to the 110, to be honest, was that we felt that it was more than adequate and yet not cost prohibitive to get all the way to 125% just to be 100, you know, to be absolutely sure. Because if you did the 125, you could end up at 150. I mean, you could end up, the margin goes both ways.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think it's important to remember that. And I think they were coming in with the science only, which is incredibly important. But you all need to weigh the science and the costs and benefits on the decision.
Yeah, I
Right,
want to
Catherine.
respond to Commissioner Hansen's comment about bumping it up, because the reality is, as I said, you know, we had an incredibly short conversation among ourselves, and with a bunch of shrugs said, well, 101, 110, 101 kind of, that sounds,
We were a little random on that.
yeah,
remember
I think
that.
we were
remember that
incredibly random.
conversation.
And what we did was we went with the staff recommendation and the experts' recommendation of 110 and said, well, 101 is good enough. That wasn't a particularly rigorous analysis that we did, is my concern. And I just want to be on the record to say, I don't feel we're bumping it up. I think we're bumping it back to where it was before we reduced it with not a lot of analytical insight.
Catherine?
So I'm perhaps connecting, well, I know I'm connecting two dots that probably don't even deserve to be connected. But where I'm looking at it, I'm kind of leaning towards Dawn at 101, because we've now added floodplain mitigation in there that wasn't there before. And while that may not be a net ecological increase, it's certainly providing a boost that isn't, you know, I know it's a different system, that's why I'm saying these two dots probably don't connect, but it certainly is providing a boost to the function of this habitat that doesn't get accounted for in any numbers. So, like, it's.
I'll just say on the floodplain, we think that the proposal we put in front of you gets floodplain back to 100%, so it's a replacement, not an enhancement of flood function.
And that's where I guess I'm saying it's not two dots that really deserve to be connected, but at the same time, floodplain enhancement wasn't, if you want to say, required or not. And I think it's great that we've pushed that along and are now including it. So in some ways, it's better than the zero we had before, is I guess where my random dot connection is going there.
Howard?
Well, I was kind of musing about what I want to say, which is basically if I can do any vote to enhance environmental protection, I'd vote for it. I'd like to err on the side of doing things better, not almost right. And if there's a margin of error here, the 110 seems like a very reasonable compromise. I'm respectful of your concerns, Don, but think if we're going to err on the side of doing this right, do it in a way that we believe really will have some impact.
Chris?
So I think you're going to see a theme for me tonight, which is that I'm going to be looking for things we can all agree on, because I think it's important when we have a recommendation, at least about the structure of the package, that we're going to be stronger if we'd have a unanimous or unanimous vote. So I'm going to explore things in the middle. So I think, Mindy, you mentioned that 104 was achievable on 2 sites if we goosed up a few things. Do we have any idea what the cost of that is compared to jumping to the third site? You know, if the third site is adding $1 to $4 million more, what would going from 101 to 104 on the 2 sites cost?
You're getting into the margin of error of our estimate, so I don't know that there's.
You're into the contingency.
I was going to say something similar. We're not 100% sold on how much can happen on West Hayden Island and Government Island. We think it's more than 100%. It's more than 101. It's probably less than 105 when you max out. So.
Question? Yeah, on Government Island, I know we've discussed this before. One of the concerns all along has been habitat conversion. What's your response? I can't remember what your response earlier was when we brought that up as a concern on West Hayden Island, because obviously you are converting. There's habitat out there. There's grassland. I know there's a lot of Himalayan blackberry too. What's the kind of conversion that's would occur on Government Island, given the proposal?
It is a conversion. All of Government Island is also functioning as habitat right now. So it is converting patches within the forest that are either reed canary grass or another kind of grass area or blackberry. So we consider that sort of closing the gaps within the forest, so it's a more contiguous forested area, and that's what's being impacted. But it is converting it from something that is functioning to a higher function.
Converting it to a higher function, as I recall, is cheaper than foresting, correct?
That is foresting.
It is foresting.
If you're, what we're talking about
Planting
is
are we planting trees?
Yeah, it's
or are we
closing
controlling invasives?
It's both. So
Okay.
it would be site prep to control the invasives, planting the trees
Okay.
and understory,
Right.
and then managing it to get the canopy up enough that it can manage itself.
With the right composition.
Right, exactly.
Great, thanks.
Other comments, questions?
Where were you headed, Chris?
I think we got a motion on the floor, right?
We've got a motion on the floor, so we've got so this is option 2B set at 110%.
Yep.
Vote?
Hanson,
No.
Hauk,
Yes.
Oxman,
Yes.
Schultz,
No.
Shapiro,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Law.
Yes. Is there any, now did you have a motion or something else you want to do on this, or? All right.
So the item number 3 on the agenda then is the floodplain, which is in attachment C. And essentially what we're doing here is taking some additional information that we have on the nature or character of the area being impacted, and we're proposing a more specific prescription for how you would design that floodplain action. So previously we had just said provide access to the floodplain for an area within the 100-year flood zone, and without a lot of additional specificity. What this is doing is saying that the existing impact area has certain characteristics of how frequent certain percentages of it flood, and we're saying do some approximation to replicate that. The language is down below on that sheet, and the reason we put X, Y, and Z is because this is an estimate of acres, and so by the time we vote on it, at your final vote, we will have confirmed our estimate to those. But currently, at the time of printing of this, it looked to us like the impacted area was about 179 acres total. The 135 of that was flooding at the 30-year event, 96 at the 10-year event, and 16 at the 2. And again, those numbers are subject to change, but it gives you the sense of how we would structure that kind of prescription. So the choice is to leave it as before or adopt this revised language.
Well, I'm going to move option 3B for purposes of discussion.
I'll second for discussion.
Discussion?
Just a comment. It's, I think we've heard kind of things all over the place in terms of what Metro exempted on West Hayden Island and South Waterfront. I think it's really important that we be clear that was an exemption for balance, cut, and fill. And we're not addressing balance, cut, and fill here by any stretch. We're talking about floodplain ecological function primarily, not balance, cut, and fill, which would require literally filling, 300 acres total, but let's say 179 for sake of discussion, and then going someplace and digging 179 acres up to create comparable flood storage capacity. That's not what we're talking about here.
So it was just volume. So
Yeah.
with South Waterfront, everything, that was just a volume, water volume
Primarily, that was
decision.
primarily the purpose
Primarily.
between balance, cut, and fill. And normally it's applied, if you're out in Fannel Creek floodplain and you have a 0.4 acre fill for a project, then they have compensation for that 0.4 acres. So I just think it's important to make that distinction. We're not going back, we're not countering that exemption. We're talking about as you pointed out, Catherine, the trying to get to a net increase in ecological function.
And from a staff perspective, just to add to Commissioner Houck's comment, you could achieve this recipe by a couple different means, and how you exactly do it will depend on what site you're able to get a hold of to do the work. But if you could find a site with topography that mirrors this recipe already, and all you need to do is remove some kind of structure to allow the flooding, that will allow the project to be on the less expensive end of the range. If on the other hand you need to do essentially balance, cut, and fill like excavation to achieve this configuration, then it's going to be more on the expensive side, and that's why there's a big range here. We don't really know. It's going to depend a lot on the site you find and what you can actually do.
And I would hope as we discuss this and make a decision, that we make it clear what we're interested in, I hope, is the full range of functions from the 2-year to the 100-year event. We can talk about costs. The cost range is obviously actually less than it was at one point in time. And I think it is important to note that, and Chris Hathaway is not here tonight, but LCREP, as we learned earlier, has done a lot of this work on the lower Columbia River, and it's entirely conceivable. And I personally, I'm not interested in sticking it to the port, making them spend more money on this kind of floodplain mitigation. If they can find a project working collaboratively with LCREP or whoever to accomplish 179 acres, went from 200 to 179 now, I guess, and achieve that ecological function, that's great.
Chris?
So I'm sympathetic to the ecological function, and I agree with Mike that I don't think that was an add-on to the package. I think it was recognizing a little bit late that in order to meet the council mandate for ecosystem increase, that we had to include this part of the ecosystem. But I'm also sensitive to the costs. Mike, I think in some private communication, you talked about whether there were ways to reduce the uncertainty and maybe put some cost caps on that. Is there anything substantive that you're interested in proposing to, maybe the 32 million is not the end of the range, or are there ways to constrain that?
Just a clarification here, according in talking with Eric, the cost range is just a staff estimate, so it's actually not part of the IGA.
Okay.
So if you're proposing a cap or some kind of cost range, that would be an addition to what we're voting on here. We're just voting on whether or not you want the 2, 10, 30-year, 100-year as an option B or the A. If you want a cap, then that's a separate.
I guess I'd put it out there.
Yeah.
If people who are smarter than me about this think there's a way that we could practically include a cap to keep the costs within some limits. I'd be interested in hearing those ideas.
Well, I'd prefer going with what is in front of us, frankly, and I think that I do feel that it's more likely, given the type of mitigation we're talking about. Breaching levees is not a simple thing. It's not that it doesn't cost, but it's the most effective, in my experience, based on my information over many years, that if you can find a site, and I think there are sites, and we heard from Chris again that they do this kind of work all the time, that you've got a seed bed there, the chances for successful restoration is very high when you're breaching levees and restoring hydrology. So I just soon go with this and let staff, again, continue to do some work and try to figure out how that can be done in a cost-effective manner.
So I guess my concern is going to be a little bit about how this is going to be portrayed after we have a package out there, a final package. Some people in the discussion are going to find it to their advantage to take the maximum value on every single thing that's arranged and add that up and say, this package costs too much. I remember enough of my engineering school statistics to say that when you combine things that have ranges, you get the bottom of the curve, you get the top of the curve, you get an expected value in the middle. Yeah. And the expected value is going to be a lot less than what the maximum possible is. And if when we present this, we can find a way to talk about that so that we have a number, particularly in the press, that's real instead of a political football, it would be really good if we could structure the final proposal so it did something like that and gave us something real we could talk about. So that's my request. I mean, the policy I like. The way the numbers show up is giving me some heartburn.
My concern is, I support the policy. My concern is cost. And I'm concerned that, I know this is a staff estimate, but that it just seems 32 million is a big number and the range is pretty large. And my proposal to come back in the section 4 is to put a cap on it and say, we can do all this, but at a certain point, the port runs out of money, and that's what we can do within that. Hopefully they can get through all of it, and they can find the land to do all the stages, and I support that. But it's not an open bucket for money. And so I'm concerned about the money, even though this is just a staff estimate, I'm concerned about the total cost in that range being part of that. And so that's a cost issue.
I guess my response to that would be, if we're going that direction, that we ought to know exactly what we're cutting, if we are cutting something. So it'd be helpful to have staff provide information to us that says, okay, if you are going to put a cap of, let's say, 18 million, because that was in option A, 3A, then this will be the result. You'll get 155 acres rather than 179. Mindy's shaking her head.
Yeah, we can't do that. Without having a site, it's very conceivable that for 18 million, you could get this whole package that's in front of you.
Well, for 16.
But it's also conceivable that you'd have a hard time finding a site without so many constraints that it would bump the cost up too. So it's, staff isn't going to be able to narrow that without actually having a site that we can look at to give you a better estimate.
Fair enough.
And that seems to be, it's a point that I'm kind of going to bring up, is that we're looking way into the future and trying to put a cost on a lot of this. And I think we ought to take into consideration that staff has done an excellent job, in my view, of trying to give us some cost ranges, but we, at the same time, got to look at it and say, if 15 years down the road we can't get there with 24 million, then we've done the people at 15 years need to figure out what they can do with 24 million or 50 million or whatever the number is that we've said, and not the new staff or whoever it is, the Mindy 2 or Eric 2, figure out what they can do with the money that we've said. And it seems to me we're trying to guess 15 years what the cost of some of this is. And this is new technology too. Gary?
Yeah. I'm hesitant for us as a commission, or I'm hesitant for myself as a commissioner, to try to be overly precise on the expenditures for mitigation when the economics of the entire project is kind of hazy, at least in my mind, it's kind of hazy. And, specifically, we've had, I think, some pretty compelling input from Bay Area economics around the conservatism and the assumptions, which in their mind were inappropriate, related to the revenue side of the economics. And then, so it feels very odd to me that we would say, gee, we want to split the difference between 18 and 24 million and try to get more precision on that end, when the whole package is not quite so clear.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to add on to Gary's thinking about this, because from a policy perspective, I agree with this approach. And I understand the impacts of all those different flood events. I've seen them on my projects, I get it. It's, the 2-year and 10-year events are shoreline impacts. And, how do you deal with that versus total inundation of a 30 and then a 100-day, we're out to lunch, So I agree with the policy approach on this, but I'm worried about the specifics. Because if anyone wants to oppose this project, all they have to do is say, write a check for $32 million. This is over. We can just go home. So policy, I'm there. We need to respond to the impacts that are going to be created. But I think there needs to be a degree of flexibility. For example, we're saying that the impact's going to be 179 acres. But when you look at the port's geometry, we're building a levee for the rail line, right? Why couldn't they breach that levee and let some of their site be inundated inside, the part that they're not utilizing? There's all kinds of ways to accommodate flood storage and flood capacity on sites. So I think there needs, but the point I'm making is as we move forward and there's more final engineering, there might be a more condensed footprint. We know the rail loop has to be the size that it is to fit, a 2-mile train on or whatever. But what happens inside that loop, we don't know yet. We really don't know. So policy-wise, we should respond to these impacts, but let's have some flexibility built into this. If we throw a $32 million number out right now, this isn't going to go anywhere. Somebody else is going to own that site. That's my perspective on this. Okay.
So do you have a better way to state we can capture
Well,
the policy?
I wish I did, Chris. If we took the dollar numbers off it, that'd be great, but that'd probably be naive too. We need to understand how much these things cost. If they could, buy a farm somewhere along the river, great. We displace farmland. 1,000 Friends of Oregon wouldn't be delighted about that, but we could find a place to compensate for this in a feasible manner. That would be okay. Chris, I don't have I'm pointing out an issue, but I'm not giving you an answer about how to solve it.
Well, responding to Don's comments, as with other types of mitigation, my concern would be what we were looking for, and that's what staff has done with the forest, is to try to get 2 large sites. The idea of flexibility sounds great, but if we had 10 projects that totaled 179 acres, you're not getting the same ecological lift as you would with a large site.
It's too fragmented.
Yeah. So I don't know the way out of this, but I had considered suggesting that we've got 2 options here, 3A and 3B. The rough estimate for 3A is 18 million. I don't hear any disagreement with the approach for 3B, the policy contained in 3B. Why not set a cap
Of?
18 million?
Oh. That's a thought.
Which I think is going to result potentially in not getting what we need. But I think there are opportunities out there. We've got a range under 3B from 16. That's less than option A to start with. So I'm reluctant to pick something out of the air. And so rather than doing that, there is an estimate attached to 3A. There's a range in 3B. That would be one possible scenario.
Good thought.
So,
I got a quick question, and part of it is, and I need to flip through, I see you got it, is describing to me what 3A is again, and could you, I guess, to this say, we'd like you to take the approach of 3B, if it exceeds 18 million, go back to 3A. And I'd have to see what 3A says again, I can't.
Yeah. 3A was 200 acres with just the 100-year event being captured, so.
And that doesn't accomplish what we need to. So
So-
I'd rather have personally, I'd rather have a smaller area that accomplishes the full range.
So I guess that was my next question. So do you go a cap of 18 million and then a minimum amount of acreage that's allowed or something too? I mean, is there some point where that under 179 becomes critical or important as well? What if it gets down to 100? Is that acceptable? And 100 costs 18 million is where I'm going, right?
We're not, I mean, again, I think, relative to Gary's comment, I think we're starting, in that sense, we're going to start picking stuff out that we are not, in my opinion, qualified.
I think we want to try to get as much flexibility here. I think what I hear is a concern about the cost and how do we address that cost, but I don't hear a disagreement about, I agree with you, Mike, about the policy. It's just about a little bit about the cost, and essentially, I think it's flexibility. How do we give someone in the future some flexibility to be innovative with really some new technology that is, not been tested a lot, and we're probably going to push that envelope to really be cost effective in their approach of what we're asking to be done. And the more prescriptive it seems that if we get, we're probably going to take options off their table. So how we do that, I'm not clear.
Well, I'm going to take another shot at this.
Well, we have an amendment. Let's vote on this, and then can we come back to how we address this in 4?
Yeah, if you want to talk about the cap in number 4, that's.
Can does that make sense? We can, if everyone's okay with the policy, and then we can come back and talk about how we address cost or flexibility. Is that, so we
That's a
can
good
just
way to
vote
move
on the 3A or 3B as a policy?
Yeah, and you had an amendment of putting a cap on 3.
We can discuss it. At 4,
And that-
we can discuss it now, or we can discuss it
Hold on.
later.
So Andre, I just clarification, so when you talk about we're in agreement on the policy, are you meaning that we want to encompass everything between a 2 and 100-year flood event as our policy for the project to be able to embrace that?
As it stands
We'll
right
come back
now,
and
yes,
talk
we
about
have
money
3A or
later.
3B, and the policy being 3B that I've heard most of us say yes, but we need to vote on that. And then we can come back with amendments to the 3B as to how people would want to amend 3B. Does that?
Fine.
So we'll vote on 3A or 3B. Julie?
Well, the motion is
Yeah.
3B.
We have a motion
3B.
for 3B.
We have a motion for 3B.
But, now wait. We're going to vote for 3B
Yes.
as written here. And then we're going to have a conversation after that.
Yes.
About the cost.
Very good.
About the cost. Yes.
Ray,
Yes.
Hanson,
No.
Yes.
Oxman,
Yes.
Schultz,
Yes.
Shapiro,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Bob.
No.
So I move, having adopted 3B, that we have a cap of $20 million on it.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion.
Discussion?
So I want to understand what it is we'd be trying to optimize within the cap. So what I inferred from what you said, Mike, is that it's more important to you that we have the 2, 10, and 30-year events covered than that we have the full acreage for the 100-year event, right? So you'd be, if we wound up with 100 acres for the 100-year event, but we got the others in, you feel better about that than making sure we had all 179 acres for the 100-year event.
That's my opinion, but I'd love to hear. I mean, I think that makes the most sense ecologically. We've got staff here who can respond to.
I think if we're going to put a constraint on, we have to say what we're asking the program to optimize under the constraint.
Right. And I think that was, although it was a little opaque, the BES memo made it very clear. There was some discussion about whether the 2-year was asking for too much, and the reality is it's extremely important from an ecological perspective. And so the whole point of this, from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from David Helzer's here from BS, we got Mindy, and others who can comment on this, that from an ecological perspective, having that range is really important, as opposed to just going for the 100-year event.
Andre, I'd like to hear that.
Mindy, do you
Mindy,
have
maybe you can begin with
Yeah,
you.
you want a little description of why the range is important? Sure. Yeah. You get different functions, basically, at those different flooding events. So a 2-year event is going to be an area that, for example, salmonids can use. It's going to flood frequently. It's going to be habitat for the salmonids on a frequent basis. Your 10-year doesn't flood as frequently, but it's really important in terms of food cycle, bringing leaf litter and structure into and exchanging all of those different exchanges you get with the bank. As Dawn was saying before, it's a lot of a bank type of function. As you move into the 30 and the 100-year, you're looking at habitat forming and habitat changing events. And so those become really important big events that we see on the landscape, where you get sediment depositing, you get sediment getting picked up, you get large wood that gets brought into the water or deposited, you get seed bank that gets deposited in areas. So that range provides you with a full range of functions. And what we were trying to get at is that's the full range that is happening now on West Hayden Island. So by adding these, we're trying to replicate that full range of function in a mitigation plan.
Mindy, do the shallow water habitat areas go under in a 2-year or a 10-year?
Oh, yeah. Well, the areas that show up as shallow water are below an ordinary high water.
They're below
and
18. Okay.
They're below the ordinary high. So the ordinary high is where we expect water to get every single year. So those areas are flooded every year. That'd be the
1 month.
seasonally, tidally. Yeah.
1 hour flood.
Exactly,
Okay, 'cause
depending
that's,
on
so those are below elevation 18.
That's right.
6 or whatever it is.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Is this thing on? Dave Helzer, biologist at BES. Yeah, I would just echo what Mindy said and also clarify as far as the memo that Mike referenced, that BES's position is that the floodplain mitigation package should replicate the existing conditions on West Hayden Island and capture these different frequencies and areas of inundation. And it was just, the language about 2-year was just highlighting that that's equally as important, if not more important than some of the less frequent inundation levels. So yeah, the idea would just be to replicate those as they're laid out here with our tentative numbers. So we're in support of that.
I'm going to ask a really dumb question, but that's okay. I excel at that. We're doing all this vegetative work, vegetative improvement on both Hayden Island and Government Island to achieve the right environment for the 210 and 30-year, 2-year and 10-year storm. Do we need to recontour land? Do we need to go in and reshape it?
It depends on the site.
What I'm getting at are, does some of our other reforestation and revegetation efforts improve this environment for these storm events?
Yeah, so
I'm trying to think about crossover costs.
Yeah. So I'll give you, I'll answer the first one. Do we have to recontour? The answer is that's site dependent. As Eric said before, if you find a site that already has the right elevations, it's just blocked by a levee or a floodgate, and you remove it, then there you go. Are we getting benefits from planting on Government Island and West Hayden Island that are floodplain benefits? Absolutely. Those areas also flood, and so when you change the mix of vegetation, removing invasives and putting in native plants, those will have a flood benefit. Yeah. From a functional standpoint, what they're not going to get at is the volume, the capacity issue.
That's recontour.
And it's not going to get to, or opening up something that you can't get the water to. So if you took like a 2-year event that exists on Government Island, the salmonids can use it today. You put trees, well, a 2-year, you wouldn't want to put trees in, they won't live. Let's go with a 10-year. Put trees in a 10-year. The salmonids can use it today. They can use it if you put trees in it. Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of the difference.
one thing I would add is that in terms of the cost estimates and the structure of the deal that is represented in the IGA, it is possible to comply with the provisions here and have a layering of some of this mitigation. So for example, the third site we talked about with the 110%, that could be coincident with the floodplain project and with some of the other grassland work that we've spelled out, or with some of the wetland mitigation that may be required under state or federal permitting. So some of those costs could blend at some point and be different than what we've characterized, and that's probably the likely scenario, especially if you put a cap on the floodplain work.
And they could blend with other projects as well.
Right.
Yeah.
For example, LCRAP, if they've got a project and you can get additional acreage, not double count, but get additional acreage in a project, then it becomes more cost effective, and it's a matter of.
I'd like to also ask this: when you looked at kind of the 100-year, 30 and 10 to your impacts, and you've come up with acres, and you come up with cost at the end of that, did you measure the cubic yards that you'd have to excavate in other locations?
No.
Okay,
No.
so the volume study's not there.
It's gonna be
Is it
dependent-
acreage, kind of X dollars an acre?
That's right.
And it's dependent entirely on whether you're lucky enough to find a site
That's already low.
that's already got that
Yeah.
characteristic. If you
With
don't,
a
then it
levee
does.
across the front.
If you just took a flat site that was at the 100-year level and did this, you'd have to dig.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cost estimates are per acre from multiple projects where different amounts of grading is necessary to achieve the objectives.
So you
it's
took
a-
an aggregate.
Yeah, it's an aggregate per acre cost for a range of projects with a range of grading.
Yeah. How much was it an acre? Do you recall?
The range is about 24,000 to 313,000 per acre.
Big range.
Yeah.
That-
Yeah, and that's reflected
That's where we don't want to
by-
narrow it.
You're looking at contamination, amount of
It's the condition of the site.
grading,
Right.
whether or not you need to protect adjacent land. So in that case, you'd have to build a new levee. Or maybe you don't have to do that. That greatly affects costs.
Yeah, so it starts at
See, and that's-
$5 a foot.
Yeah, I think we should acknowledge that staff has really done fabulous work to narrow from where we started on this to the point we're at now. It sounds like, we've got the 16 to 32, but compared to where we were, we have a lot more certainty, in my opinion, now than we did.
Well, I'm motivated on this multi-tier, approach to this of 2, 10, 30, and 100. But the throwing a number out of 32 million is going to stop this. It's going to stop this.
So
Well, we have an option on the table.
$20 million on the table. Tell you.
Well, so I'm listening to the interchange here and, understanding that there are synergies between all these mitigation actions. And, we're going to get better bang for our buck the more synergies we can find. So with respect to Howard's motion for a cap on the floodplain piece, is it more logical to have a cap on the overall mitigation costs as a package rather than picking a piece and saying we're going to constrain that one? I don't know the right answer to that. I just want to throw it out there so some smart people can, so Mike can tell me I'm wrong.
Well, maybe we should.
I suspect
we could
not.
look at the 20 and go through this whole thing and do a tally at the end. See where we are.
Just in terms of kind of my look at it, I like a cap on certain activities because I like the idea of driving whoever's doing this in the future to think about how you can combine, go search out people that are already doing this and leverage the money. It is clear to me the port can't do this alone, and they've said so, but they're making the argument they got to do it alone. So a little bit of disagreement there in their own camp. But at the same time, I think we need to push the future people, implementers of this, to look at how they can work together with the other agencies, the other federal and state, and nonprofits out there doing this work to leverage the costs, and kind of having the upper limit doesn't do that. It's more about us sending a message in the future about doing doing more efficient work. It's not saying, I don't want them to do the work. So, and just one last thing, I would like to amend your amendment to say that it is really 3B with the cap language, so that it's all, it doesn't have the, 3B now has the language of estimated 16 to 32. I'd like to remove that language and put in the cap at the 20.
It's a good amendment.
Yeah, just a comment. There is an incentive. I don't think, I mean, I agree with everything you said, but the fact of the matter is, the port will be looking at those opportunities. If there's a cap, say it's $20 million, there is an incentive built in to look for other ways to achieve these objectives.
For less than 20.
Yes.
Yes.
That's why, hence the range, 16 to 32.
Just for clarification, if someone were to ask you why you went from 18 to 20, I think it's important
We
that
just say
you're
Howard,
able
yeah.
to
Howard.
show intent and that the number didn't just come out of thin air. So you might want to think about whether or not you want to just keep it at 18. Or if you want to do 20, then you need to, I think you need to have a sentence that explains why you went to 20.
And my response to that would be we have a range under 3B from 16 to 32, and we had a pretty robust conversation about what we were after, and that 20, based on that conversation, seemed like a reasonable number. That would be my response.
I just wanted to have the notes
Yeah.
reflect where that, because I think
Sure.
one of the things as you're doing this also is, there's going to be, as right now, there's going to be things that come up that don't really require another amendment, so that we're at 11:55 still here doing, well, I want to amend your amendment. But there's an opportunity to, with the notes that Julie's taking, to show the intent and to be able to hand that intent and the notes over to council when they're making their decision.
I think what I've heard is the intent is that we want to do 3B and achieve the 2, 10, 30, and 100-year floodplain. We're concerned about the costs. 20, we had a range 16 to 32. 20 million is above the minimum, and it gives them some flexibility, which we were concerned about, to achieve our intent of 2 to 100-year full compliance. And I think if they can do it for 20 or 20 less at 16, more power to them.
I gave a lot of thought and consideration and analytics to the 20.
Trying to help you out, Howard.
And I appreciate you guys being superficial, but there's a lot of intent here.
Yeah.
Went into it.
You should see the spreadsheet on his iPad. It's incredible.
Gary?
Yeah, I'm trying to appreciate what the added value is of having a cap there. Because it seems to me there's a very powerful intrinsic motivation for the port to find cost-effective ways to get to the policy solution on the range of 2 to 100-year events, if we're saying that's the policy intent, which I believe we're saying. But then to say, well, 20 million is the cap. So if you don't get to the 30-year event coverage with the 20 million, what does that say? If you don't get to the 100 with the 20 million, what does that say? Where does that put us in terms of the support or the violation of intent, and what's the consequence for that?
Well, there'll be jurisdictional requirements kind of on top of what we're talking about. If you want to build, you have to compensate. You have to compensate for the 100-year floodplain. Am I correct? If you want to go get a federal permit to fill on the island?
No, with the exemption, the Title III exemption for balance, cut, and fill, you don't have to meet that part of the requirement. There's still the no net rise requirement that would still have to be met per FEMA, but that's different. The question that we're still waiting on with the floodplain is if there will be NOAA requirements for salmonids related to the floodplain, and there's a lot of action around that with lawsuits and so forth. So there could still be federal requirements related to salmonids in the 100-year floodplain.
Kind of above and beyond the volume, which is exempt
exactly.
by Metro's action.
Exactly.
Okay. Why'd they do
I don't know, Gary, I mean, I don't know if we, if there's an consequence for not doing it, but in the first part of the first milestone for the, for this to occur, this whole plan to occur, there's a business plan that must be developed. And as part of that business plan, I would assume that someone's going to look at how do I fund up to 100 years with $20 million, and how do I do that efficiently, looking to leverage. And they're going to have to do that for the entire plan to figure out how to fund it. And that's really a funding mechanism.
Yeah, and I think that's a very positive thing in section 9.4, and it's been further enhanced in the later draft. So I very much support that approach, because I think that's the way to back away from some of the extreme conservatism that's characterized the revenue side of the equation. So I'm just, I'm just kind of adopting a marketeer approach here to say, gee, if we're allowing that flexibility on the revenue and profitability side, shouldn't that same flexibility apply to the cost side? And why are we specifically capping things that are intended to counteract the damage caused by this project? And I would bring the same question back about the health impacts as well. It's just, if they're going to make this work economically, they need to figure out how to do so within reasonable ecologic and human health impact constraints. And if they can't do it, then by putting a cap there, in effect, we're giving them policy permission to not achieve what we think is good policy. So I'm struggling with that.
Appreciate that. Did you have a comment, Mike?
No, I appreciate Gary bringing that up. It's right on. And we're here talking policy, and my response was there shouldn't be a cap, but we need to move this forward. And I think taking this policy approach, accepting that, I guess I'm just hoping that staff is right, is that they're at the bottom end of the range, that there will be opportunities that will accomplish exactly what we're trying to do. This is a policy conversation. If we just went strictly on science, I would say there shouldn't be a cap.
Other discussion? There's a amendment on the table for 20 million.
You restate it so I know exactly what I'm voting for.
So the amendment on the table is for, or not the amendment, the amendment is for a 20 million cap, $20 million cap on option 3B. And I would like to just amend your amendment to say that we're really amending 3B to remove the estimate of 16 to 32 million and amend 3B, our previous 3B, to show the $20 million cap.
The estimate's not in the language.
But it's in the staff report.
Oh, okay.
So I'd like to remove that and just have the 20 million.
Good.
Any other comments? Julie?
Gray?
Yes.
Hanson?
Yes.
Hauk?
Yes.
Oxman?
No.
Schultz?
Yes.
Shapiro?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Ball?
Yes. Okay.
Mr. Chair, before we dive into section 4, could I nominate a couple more items to go on that list?
Well, we're going to go to section 4, and that will be nomination time. So we'll just go around the room, and we have the items that were pulled off earlier.
Right.
And then we'll take those up, and then we'll go around and.
Okay.
So this is attachment D.
No, this is
The things we pulled off of.
the items that we pulled off in section 1. We'll go through those first for comment
and I have items 41, 69, 73, and 75 from attachment A that you pulled, plus a generic statement about wanting to talk about parks.
And talk about parks. And then we'll go around the room and ask for any additional amendments, and we'll address those. Gary, did you have a question?
No.
So we'll just go down the list. Item 41, correct?
Did we want to take nominations from, so we have a full list first, or do you want to do the ones I already have first?
Let's take the ones we already have so that we can get through those.
Some progress.
Okay, so 41 on attachment A is,
I hope this is right.
this was a, on page, we should probably point out what page this is on in the draft. For those of you who have the draft in front of you, it's page 95 in the approval criteria for resource review in the event that some action triggers resource review on West Hayden Island. We're talking about what the approval criteria would be. And in the first, I believe we're talking about A1, is that correct, Mindy?
Yep.
And also A4. And what staff is proposing is to, essentially there's more than one issue we attempted to address in 1A, and we think it would be clear if you pulled out the no net loss piece and put that in the mitigation part rather than it being bundled in the first part, which was about minimizing impacts to resources and functional values. Did I get that right?
Do you want me to restate that?
Two different. You can repeat the page number that's on.
Page 95.
Which page are
95.
you working off of here?
Page 95.
Oh, I'm sorry. The page 95 is in the code,
In the
in the big
code.
package that you had.
Number 41.
It's
And it's number
41.
41 in your attachment A. But attachment A just is pretty general in its description, so it may help to look at the actual page
I
95.
don't see it there. That's not
Right.
right.
So again, these are the approval criteria for when someone is going through a resource review. So these are the criteria that the applicant needs to meet. And the way that we had it set up was the first one was a no net loss. So the development and mitigation plan would have a no net loss. And the explanation of minimizing impacts isn't found until number 4. And we agree that that order is kind of out of place. And when we went back to the way that we do this throughout the rest of the city in environmental review, the minimization language is first, and then the no net loss is a qualifier on the mitigation plan. So we're agreeing to restore that to the number 1 would go back to minimize impacts, and under number 4, which is the mitigation plan, that it achieves a no net loss. So we think that's clearer and it's a better hierarchy in the code.
And keep in mind, this language is in the approval criteria, so this would only apply if something's undergoing resource review.
That's right.
Which would mean, the way you currently have the code structured, it would apply to dock construction or other unforeseen recreational improvements in the open space. Those are the scenarios where which you could go through review.
Yeah, so is that clear, what we're proposing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody okay? Okay. Yep.
So the next one was 69, which was actually on our errata sheet from a few weeks ago, and this is in the IGA in section 8.3, and we were trying to clarify in some confusing language that we realized people had different interpretations of. And I'll try and find the section of the IGA that it's in.
Page 135.
Thank you. On page 135, it's about the sponsorship of the IGA or of the advisory committee and how it gets set up.
Yeah, so I think I got this onto the errata list with my first review of the document, but I think it said the port and the mayor appoint, and you can't have 2 appointing authorities, right? So we made it clear that the mayor's going to appoint and then he'll consult with the port in doing that. Is that where we wound up with here?
The intent of the language was that both bodies would need to approve the appointment. If you want to change that, that could be an amendment.
So
We tried to clarify it with,
help me with the process. So the mayor would nominate people, the city council would vote up or down, and then the port commission votes up or down on the same people?
with an IGA, you wouldn't have to go to city council. It would be a mayor appointment, and the same would be true from the port side. The port director would, they'd have to decide whether they needed to bring it to their commission or not. But on the city side, with an IGA, you wouldn't have to go to council with that.
So I'm still confused. So somebody nominates and somebody approves, right? So does the mayor nominate and Bill Wyatt could say, sorry, I don't want that person, and cross them off the list, or?
They have to, the intent was they have to agree on the advisory committee. So you could do it differently, but that was what the staff wrote, or tried to write.
Chris, is there a different approach? I kind of see the conflict that you put your finger on.
Right.
I don't know.
I get that. I mean, it's kind of like what Metro and JPAC have to do on the regional transportation plan. They both have to vote yes or it doesn't count.
Yeah, I mean, there are other examples where advisory committees are created by multiple agencies, and they effectively they have to agree, and that we've successfully navigated that before, so we're saying that that's how we do it.
Can the port and the city nominate kind of half and half, 6 of one, 5 of the other, and create the committee?
There are a number of different rules you could set up about
I just
how-
see a conflict in, you know, one, the mayor saying one and then going to the port, or the port going to the mayor.
Jury selection.
Yeah, it just seems like it's, I got a first right of refusal to eliminate 3 or something. I don't know.
You like jury selection?
Jury selection.
There are examples of city-county commissions, for example, that you have a set number decided ahead of time, but you would have to pick the total number of the committee now, or you could just say that each gets to pick 50%.
But this is complicated by the fact you also have to make sure certain constituencies are represented,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And my experience is it hurts that because each body wants to make a broad selection and be the ones that looked broadly, and that if there's only 9 people on the committee, each of them had 4 or 5 people to appoint, and they didn't get to appoint the broad selection they wanted to. And the city and county then fights in those examples for who got to be the one that appointed this group or that group.
Majority.
So I think the collaborative approach would definitely be benefited. If this project's gonna happen, there's gonna have to be a lot of collaboration. Obviously, we're saying that I think that's gonna happen as we get to the last couple points here about, needing to have the state and needing to have others be all a part of this project, or, in terms of the dollar costs.
So if we're designating who the appointing official is at the city, shouldn't we also designate who the appointing official at the port is?
You could. We didn't want to presume on behalf of the port.
The director.
Yeah, can we do that?
Port director.
Port director?
Sure.
Makes sense.
Our staff assumption is that before they sign this, they would say who that was, but you can certainly start someplace.
Do I hear a motion?
Are you going to, we didn't vote on the first one of these, and so what you did was you asked if anyone had an issue with it, so,
Change it,
and the
right.
same thing on
Do
this
you want
one?
to, well, if they want to
Voting for
change it,
changing,
we
right?
didn't change that one.
Okay.
We're going to change this one maybe.
I don't have language to suggest, so.
Any suggestions? Then we're okay? Okay.
We're out of.
And then 73 is, this is the proposed amendments to the non-appropriation of funds in section 9.3. And that's on page 135 and 136. It straddles those pages in the agreement. And what we did here, working with the city attorney, is provide some detail on documenting and shedding some light on what would happen if we reach that kind of a, insufficient funds conclusion, what the procedure would be so that it would be in the light of day. Doesn't solve where you get the money, but it says how you document the next steps.
So the principle here is that the advisory committee is kind of the public input body for all the changes to the IGA. So any of the exit ramps here, if the city and port are going to negotiate new conditions, that's going to have to go through the advisory committee and have some public airing, right?
It sets that, it sets up that expectation that the advisory committee is the universal sort of check-in with group. There are, to be clear, there are still decisions that they're not a voting body in the sense that they could veto the change, but the port and the city are committing to bring those issues to them.
Right. I mean, so the outcome I want to avoid is that, the mayor and the port director have a beer and something shows up on consent agenda at city council some Wednesday morning and the agreement is suddenly different, right? And nobody's cottoned on to it.
Right. So this would effectively prevent that kind of rapid fire amendment by putting some process around
Deliberation.
Deliberation.
And just for the benefit of my colleagues and talking to staff, I suggested should the PSC be that review body along the way, and I didn't hear a lot of enthusiasm for that, so I'm not suggesting it, but I just wanted to put it out there.
What a shock.
Wouldn't stop you from campaigning to be on the advisory committee.
So they have the ability to regroup. They're going down the tubes.
Well, I'll raise the issue, and it's the same issue with 75 when we get to that we've heard testimony that, and I wasn't there, and Leilani's not here, she was on Airport Futures, that there was a much, sounded like tighter, less flexible arrangement, and I don't know if you can comment on it, in the Airport Futures that dealt with the legal concerns that city legal staff had.
The language here is modeled after the Airport Futures. I don't know that the Airport Futures had the same issue with non-appropriation of funds because I don't think that agreement was spelling out financial commitments in the same way that this one is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my concern is actually more with 75 than 73 in that regard. Okay.
Other questions on 73?
No.
No, we're good? Okay. 75.
Okay, so 75 is a partner with that last one. It just spells out the next step beyond the finding of insufficient funds, what you do to document that. So it's really the same discussion you just had. It's just closing the loop with communication.
A question I have relative to both of these, and I waited to this one, is we have in 9.4 the business plan milestone conversation. So if the business plan doesn't move ahead, how does this work with the business plan? Because if there's not sufficient funding in the business plan proposal, it doesn't move ahead. So how do these then trigger?
In 9.4, what staff had suggested is that you make the business plan part of the first milestone in the project. And so that would be the first hurdle, is so you either come up with a coherent business plan or you don't. That's one off-ramp, I suppose, that would trigger a change.
So if they don't come up with because down in the future, you don't come up with a consistent funding plan that works, then do they trigger 9.6 and 9.5?
I think
Or
that's,
9.3?
as I understand it, that's one possible outcome, is that you reach the end of the business plan and conclude that there isn't going to be a way to do this, then that could lead to someone proposing an amendment to the IGA or concluding that we aren't moving forward. That's one off-ramp. There are others.
Okay.
I don't know if it's sort of academic, whether it triggers the reprioritization of funding or just directly triggers conversation about amendment to the agreement.
Agreement, yeah, that's,
Any one of these points, you sort of have those multiple steps as you go towards resolution of conflict or a change in the agreement.
so these are really tied to if there's no funding available out of that business plan then.
Or a later date. You might have a business plan that anticipates a plan to seek certain kinds of money for certain kinds of activity, and then if that fails to materialize, you trigger 9.5 and 9.6, or sorry, 9.6 and 9.3.
Other questions?
Well, the difference I see in this one is that this is also has the off-ramp of terminating the agreement by either party.
Right, and that was always true. It's just that we've spelled out the connection between this and that with this language a little more clearly.
Eric, does it say, then you go back to you can go back to the IGA and amend it? Does it say those words?
There's a separate section in here that says we have the ability to amend it. So you don't have to go through this section to reach the conclusion that you want to amend the agreement, but it's one possible path as we understand it. It's not, I guess my answer is, and the city attorney, I believe, is here if you wanted to ask a clarifying question, but my understanding is you don't need to list every possible contingency that would lead you to want to amend the agreement. There is generalized amendment language.
Okay.
So
Other questions on 75?
You had a question.
Everybody's good? No amendments?
Yep.
Okay, 75.
So then the next one I had on my list was a general discussion about parks that you wanted.
Yeah.
And just for reference, if you're going to talk about parks, the section that deals most directly with that would be Section 3.2 of the IGA, which is about recreational improvements, and then Section 4, which is about further open space use and planning. So those, which is page 122 through 125. That's generally the section of the agreement that deals with parks.
So to clarify, we've had a lot of testimony about and discussion of the idea of a boat launch park near the railroad line, right? So there's sort of this assumption out there, but to be clear, the code, the IGA language does not say that, right? The IGA language says a 3-acre park somewhere east of the railroad line. It could be way east of the railroad line, right? It doesn't have to be immediately east of the railroad line. It doesn't say that Portland Parks and Rec gets to approve whether that's an appropriate site or not, right? Just said the port's going to buy 3 acres somewhere in the neighborhood boundaries. Is there an assumption about sort of what the level of collaboration is?
There is, I think, an assumption that there would be discussion of that within the structure of the open space planning process, but you're correct. It doesn't nail that down to give anyone the veto power, is my understanding. It's true that the way that we've described the park's improvements was not a boat ramp. It was simply a park with potentially with some waterfront frontage, but we didn't cost out a boat ramp as part of this package and have not recommended that.
So, I mean, just, we're establishing legislative intent here, if that's part of what we're doing tonight. you know, I am much more interested in the park for active recreation opportunities. A boat launch somewhere on the island would be a wonderful regional facility, but I don't think it particularly has a policy nexus with this project, whereas, you know, a neighborhood park with active recreation opportunities, to me, seems like an appropriate partial offset for some of the health stuff. So hoping that's what, you know, Portland Parks and Rec will be helping develop along with the port.
What are you thinking of with regard to active recreation?
Well, you know, I've said in any number of the hearings before, I kind of like the Thunderbird site, better adjacency to the mobile home community, but I want to make sure it's a place where people, it's more about people walking and doing other things as opposed to launching boats.
Yeah.
Other comments on the park?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on the parks. You know, I understand that the trail system and the proposed park improvements and trailhead that we're doing west of the railroad tracks. That is part of the overall open space strategy. And that, I think, has a connection to the project. I don't see a connection between the project impacts and doing a neighborhood park on Hayden Island. Even though I acknowledge that it's a park deficient area, I don't see the linkage. Building this facility on West Hayden Island is not going to increase the demand for a park. And, you know, when I think about, you know, and I've thought a lot about this, you know, because I think the people that would benefit from the most are the people in the mobile home community. But I'll compliment the owner and manager of that facility. They have wonderful open space amenities on their site. They have 2 clubhouses, they have 4 swimming pools, they have trails, they have a softball field, they have playgrounds. It's a wonderful environment. And so I don't know why we're building a 2 or 3 acre park. It's either going to be next door to it on the east side or next door to it on the west side when you look at the kind of land that's available on West Hayden Island, unless you want to start taking out the auto auction. But I think if you want to do this park, you want to put it on the river. But again, I don't see the linkage between the impact of the West Hayden Island development and the need for a park on West Hayden Island. I truly don't. And I think I think it's easy to challenge this notion as this process moves along. We really do need to think about, you know, a nexus between our impacts and what we're requiring of the project moving forward. I think we've kind of given ourselves that test on traffic. We've given ourselves that test on reforestation and floodplain mitigation. I think we've given ourselves that test to an extent on health impacts, which is a new frontier for us, Gary. But, you know, on parks, I don't see it. I just don't see the connection.
You want to rebut that, or shall I? So one of the things that the health assessment told us is that active recreation opportunities are a potential offset for the air quality impacts. And Don, I appreciate your insight that the mobile home community has some of those opportunities already today. I mean, that was a piece that I didn't understand. But the mobile home community are not the only folks impacted by this. There's the larger island community. They may not be impacted as directly or significantly, but, you know, we know that Hayden Island is underparked. And I think there is a nexus through the health analysis to create those opportunities. I think as we're learning a little more, the exact placement, you know, may not be as obvious as I thought it was once, but I think having it on the island somewhere is a benefit to the larger community that does have a nexus through the air quality impacts to this project.
Okay. From a staff perspective, just to remind you that the parks are, both sites, in fact, are noted in the adopted Hayden Island plan. So it's really not a question of whether it's city policy to encourage development of a park there over the long term. It's really what we're talking about is a strategy as to how you get there. And so it's whether we're trying to pay for it through this port development or there's another strategy. And I'm not going to pretend there are a lot of other options, but that's part of the conversation is how, not so much if.
Yeah, I agree with if. I think there should be a park on the island. You can't really go to the water anywhere out there. It's a good idea for a lot of reasons, but who pays for it? What project is it part of? That's my question.
Other comments? Gary,
It's, this will sound simplistic, but.
I might understand it.
No,
Good thinking, Gary.
The idea of an offset, as Chris said, I think is a good idea. It really does come down to the detail around whether this is a specific facility that is going to be utilized and is desirable to the community that's going to be impacted, whose health is going to be impacted by the other effects of the project. And so I'm not sure we're at that level of detail. So I think the principle of parks is good, is a valid principle, but it, how it happens and who the population is and exactly what facilities does make a difference.
And
if
also,
it's
I
just
think-
an increment to already, a very large network of regional parks, then Don, I would, really agree with your point that why should that be funded out of West Hayden Island development money? But if it is really neighborhood specific, then I would lean the other direction.
Okay. So I would also say that, one of the big, I think, active recreation benefits is going to be having a continuous sidewalk along North Hayden Island Drive. That's very nice. It meanders through a landscape area that's away from the moving traffic a little bit. That's a terrific linear recreation opportunity. It's pretty long run or walk, whichever you do.
Depending on the pollution mitigation.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
I would, but I'm kind of in the camp of, I think you need a park. I think our first obligation is to the trails west of the railroad tracks to get that done. It seems to me there is a nexus between the parks and what we're doing here because we're not sure of what the second HIA is going to come back and say for mitigation. And we do have some money set aside for that, but I think the park is in part of that mitigation if I have to look out further. I don't know that the 3 acres or the 2.7 acres that we're designating to buy here for the port to buy are the right 2.7 acres. That seems a little micromanagement 15 years or 10 years down the road. To me, I think there needs to be more flexibility, again, to see can we, if CRC shows up 20 years from now, could you get in with them on some kind of park situation that you could leverage that money with them and the port not have to buy land and do something. So I'm more concerned about trying to provide more flexibility for the Parks Department to leverage the money that they have to build the most robust facility. And I would say active recreation, as a boater, I'm going to say this, less a boat ramp and let the boat ramp come later, but that it be a walking facility and active facility from that standpoint. So I'm concerned about trying to tie down three acres today that there's a commitment to buy or for someone to go purchase, and whether or not that's the right 3 acres that they could take that money and leverage somewhere else and do more with down the road. Or maybe it becomes the 3 acres, but I'm concerned about the tie-in of the 3 acres.
Somewhat to that point, if, let's just say, once we get through a deeper analysis in the health assessment, and let's say sound becomes a much bigger issue than air pollution. And that, let's say, for instance, the CRC is creating a lot more air pollution than West Hayden Island Port Facility. So it seems to me, again, you're going back to what Don's saying. You've tied something to West Hayden Island that maybe is inappropriately being mitigated. For instance, maybe more money needs to go into sound mitigation. But now all of a sudden we've committed to building a park. So maybe tying together those two thoughts is it's just a bigger bundle of flexibility and cash that gets resolved later when that health assessment's done. Instead of saying X goes to parks and X goes to upgrading the mobile home park, maybe they need to be resolved at a later date when we have more information.
Well, I still believe that the trails, though, at the park on the west side are kind of an absolute. They have to spend the money there and whatever it takes for that.
No, I agree with that. Yeah.
It's just the other part. Yeah. Saying buy 3 acres and go there.
Yep, I'm with you there.
Because if you mandate that somebody goes and buys 3 acres in the future, price of that 3 acres is gonna go up a little bit.
Yeah.
And we all know where those 3 acres are. So it puts the buyer in an awkward position, to put it mildly.
So is there amendment, comments, other? Amendment on the table that someone wants to propose about the parks, or are we good with the language that we have, or just talk about intent?
Well, I'm good with the language that we have, as long as we don't point the finger at who pays for this exactly and what their share is.
Language does that, doesn't
Well, the language does that.
I know.
it? So you're good with it
So
except
you
for what it
can't be good
says.
with the language.
Easing my way into this. Easing my way into this. I don't think the language should commit the port to building an off-site park. I think the language should commit the port to doing the recreation improvements on their property, which are trail systems, also good active recreation, but not off-site at this point.
So are you taking the money away too, or are you just taking the park away?
I'm taking money away. They go together.
Okay.
So this is an amendment to remove the intention of making the park and the funding.
So this would remove the purchase of properties on Hayden Island for more active community park, 2.7 acres plus,
Right.
capital
Right.
improvements of the 2.7 acres.
Right.
And the 10 years of O&M for the 2.7 acres.
Right.
Yes, that's what I'm proposing.
Those 3 items.
Sorry, clarifying question.
Which are about 13
I
point.
I see 3 acres in the language. I don't see 2.7. What?
In some of the cost estimates, the
Okay.
words 2.7 show up. The 3 is, I believe, what's in the agreement draft.
So Don, are you suggesting striking all of 3.2.2?
Yeah.
So that includes buying the land. I think there's a total of 8 million for the development of it. So
It's about $2.8 million when you do the math.
well, that's just the purchase, or that's
That's the purchase, the estimated purchase, according to the sheet here that Eric has. The estimated purchase is 3 million, 7.6 is the capital improvements, and 2.2 for O&M for 10 years. So that would be operations and management, part of 3.24, part of 3.23, and then part of 3.22. They're
12.8 million, I
Huh?
think. 12.8 if I got
12.8,
my.
yeah.
okay.
12.8.
That's-
So they're lined out there, but
But the 2.4 million of the recreation and trail development stays,
Stays.
As
and
does
the
the
10 years
open
of
space
West,
follow-up planning
and the
also.
West Hayden
and
Island.
the open space follow-up planning stays.
Yeah.
Yes. So we keep the first 3, and I'm advocating eliminating the next
Next 3.
3.
Is there a second?
Second,
Who's in second? Discussion?
Karen. Well, I'm going to vote no.
Well, here's my take on it, Don. I agree in part with, again, the park. I don't agree with the money side, and I more agree with what Catherine's talking about, is providing some flexibility for that money in the future, that parks can look at through as part of the mitigation. We don't know what that looks like, whether or not they could leverage the money to do something else with the park, or the health analysis comes out and says, do X, Y, Z, that'd be a better option for it. And that gives you some capital at that time to go do something. But the way it's described today, the park seems too prescriptive, and the 3 acres is very prescriptive.
It seems prescriptive to me too, even when I consider it in reference to a health impact analysis. You know, The best solution on health impact analysis might be a continuous waterfront trail across the frontage of the mobile home park, which does not exist. And maybe it links over to the proposed trail improvement along North Hayden Island Drive. So you get a series of walking circuits. That might have more benefit than an object park on the island.
Well, but if you tie the money, I guess if you tie the money to the health and impact analysis and say, if you can build that trail with this $12.8 million, that would be a perfect opportunity, or you build a park or.
Well, we're building half of the trail with the road improvement project.
Well, but what happens to the other half? I'm just trying to put an option out there.
So suppose we didn't strike 322, but instead added to it that if subsequent health analysis suggests a different set of mitigations, the funds could be reprogrammed to those. We keep this in as sort of the best thing we know to do right now, but if we find something smarter to do in the future, we have that option open.
So Chris, it's a placeholder.
Yeah.
We know it's an issue that needs to be addressed, park deficiency and wellness.
And we put a price tag on it so we know about what it's going to cost.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're not prescribing those 3 acres. It seems like really pointing to, I agree with Don there.
So you've got first and second.
So first and second, do you want to amend what we're?
I think the purpose is too different to amend. If we're going to go that way, we got to vote down the first one first and then come up with some new language.
I guess, you know, we can have a little bit more discussion about this. You know, I've stated my position on this and why. And another part of my position is that this is so easy to challenge past our process. You could get this booted easily because there's no connection, there's no nexus between our impacts and what we're proposing. That's my motivation.
So you're talking about Dolan?
What?
You're talking about Dolan?
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask staff to help me here, but my understanding from other staff responses is that if this is an IGA entered into voluntarily between the city and the port, it's not subject to Dolan challenge. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it may be getting at whether the port would agree to sign it, but if they did.
They'd have the
Is that
strength
because
of
there are two public agencies? Is that the Dolan issue?
Well,
No.
they'd be signing in
It's
an
the
IGA,
nexus.
so if they've signed it, they've agreed to it. I mean, I think you're right that it's something that may be a reason for them not signing, but once you've signed an agreement like that, our analysis and our conversation is that you can't
Yeah, and
do Dolan.
I'm challenging us now on this issue because this issue will be challenged later.
Don, I want to make sure I'm understanding. You're saying there's, the vulnerability here is the weak connection to the actual port development, and you therefore see it as being vulnerable in front of the council and vulnerable to be booted out from the IGA eventually.
Yeah, I don't agree with that in the sense that I've seen lots of projects that may involve, I'm not going to use a BS project for obvious reasons, but there are community impacts that then result in trying to enhance the neighborhood that experiences those impacts. So I don't think it's that much of a stretch, personally.
Maybe first we
I
need
mean,
to have a
I'm
straw poll to
not
see if we agree with
arguing
nexus.
for the 3 acres or not. I'm just saying in terms of providing some relief from impacts, generally speaking, on the neighborhood, that whether it's a trail or, you know, the other options that you were describing, I don't think there's a lack of nexus in that regard.
Historically, in the Great West Hayden Island processes, what was the origin of the park proposal?
It's really the Hayden Island plan that showed it, Gary, and the parks
Back to the concept
declared
plan
this
or
as a
the-
park deficient area.
Neighborhood plan. even
And it
before
was as you said, it was seen as not a direct mitigation, but a way to an offset of some of the community impacts. It did arrive in increments. We started with just the piece with the port purchasing, and then later the part about them funding the improvements to the project, or to the park, was added in the November draft. And then we clarified the O&M language in the March draft based on further consultation with the park. So it showed up in 3 stages, but the origin was this offset idea.
Was in the, so it's all part of the action in the last year or so.
Yeah, the first version back in August, the August 2012 draft from staff just had the purchase of property on East Hayden Island to sort of kickstart the park development. Then the November draft from Mayor Adams added, let's fund the capital improvements. And then our latest draft said, well, if you're going to do that, you need to pay for the O&M, and we more accurately projected that.
Karen?
Yeah, so just a little bit of a weigh-in on listening to this whole conversation here for the last half an hour or so. I kind of like the idea of what Catherine said. And what I hear about that is, I would think that it would make sense to put aside some money. I don't know if it's $12.8 million of port money, but I think a certain amount of money, not necessarily though for a park. And I think that from what I've heard people say, a park may not be the answer here at all. But I don't think that we know exactly what the answer is. And I think that there's more health impact study that we're going to be having, which may show various things, and we're locking it into 3.22 to say it's a park and it's going to look like this and it's going to cost this much for this, this, and this. I do like the idea of locking in some money, though. I'm not really clear how much the money should be when we're locking in $2.8 million of somebody else's money. But I think something needs to be set aside for a cogent conversation later when more health impact information comes in. So I disagree with leaving 3.22 the way it is and then saying, well, if we get other information, we can change it. I think 3.22 needs to be rewritten. That's my opinion.
So we have an amendment on the table that Don proposed. Any other conversation or discussion?
Can you refresh our memory on what the amendment is?
To strike 3.22.
I think it's just to strike it, right?
To strike.
I move to strike $12.8 million from this budget, which eliminates the purchase of capital improvements in the 10-year O&M on a 2.7-acre park.
Yep.
We had a lot of other discussions about there might be kind of different versions of that, but that's what my motion was.
So it'll eliminate the purchase of the property, eliminate development of a park, eliminate operations and maintenance of that park over 10 years.
And for clarity, you can always offer another amendment
Yep.
to do something different.
That was going to be my question.
Right.
Yes.
Right, I'd have
So you
to
can
know
strike
there
it
was
and then
something
come
else
back with.
to do.
So we can strike it out, and then we can come back and add something back in. Because we will be done with the amendments, and we can take this up right away. So let's vote.
Gray,
Yes.
Hanson,
Yes.
Hauk,
Yes.
Oxman,
Yes.
Schultz,
Yes.
Shapiro,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Law.
Yes. So we've taken out the park. So,
But
But-
amended.
but,
I know.
I have some thoughts on,
okay, so now
As it gets
a discussion of amendments, and we'll go. Don, you wanna?
I think it's critical that here's what I'm thinking, I'll just say it real simply. The budget that was going to be used to purchase that land maybe should be applied to recreation facilities and waterfront access on the island. That doesn't, again, prescribe that it's a square park site or a triangular park site or whatever, but that it gives the neighbors an opportunity to go to the river, gives them an opportunity for active recreation that counteracts some of the health impacts of this facility. So what I'm saying is that we keep the $3 million on the table. Be used for site acquisition, because there's very few sites left. And who knows, if this happens in conjunction with the CRC improvements, maybe that $3 million could go right to improvements instead of land purchase. That's the thought that's in my mind.
Say that clearer so I can understand it. You want to put $3 million back into the budget to provide for some facility at some point, not yet determined,
Right.
that will increase the advantage of
And we'll address the park deficiency that's on the island, or recreation.
just adding an amount of money for an intention not yet defined.
Yeah. Yep. Something flexible.
But it sounds like the intention being recreation,
Well,
tied
that's
to
what I mean.
Because it's going
recreation.
into the line
An
item.
unnamed
called-
recreational at some point.
So you're gonna
Second-
put
I'll
it-
second that motion, Don.
Well, let's not second it because we want to listen to,
Oh.
let's get
sorry.
one contingent
Yeah, I haven't made that
motion.
motion.
Yeah, there's no motion on the table,
I
so.
told you what my thought was.
Okay.
And I just want to
Yeah.
clarify what you're saying before we move. So this is the line item that says West Hayden Island Recreation / Trail Development. That's where you want to add the 3 million. Okay.
Yeah. You know, we might spend the whole 3 on trails.
Okay. Chris?
So I'd suggest that maybe the right term of art would be active recreation and river access. If that
Thank you.
sounds right.
That's a good term.
But I'd say 10 million, not 3 million. So.
You're sitting next to Howard.
And,
Mike?
Don, I was trying to get at exactly what was your proposal financially, because there's 3 line items here related to the park.
So the,
We struck
where
12.
it says the West Hayden Island Recreation Trail Development for 2.4
Well, we're on this spreadsheet is what we're
on
reading
that
over here.
spreadsheet.
Yeah,
That's
we're
what
looking
I'm
at
on.
this.
That 2.4 line item, Don's proposing to add $3 million to make that 5.4 million.
Okay, but if we're using this as the scorecard, we struck the second, third, and fourth from the bottom, right, in the last motion?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah,
So
we
the
just
3,
cut
7,
$13
and
million out of
2.2
12.8.
are.
Which is a total of 12.8.
12.8.
Right, so the question is, what are we backfilling the 12.8 with?
What are we
and-
backfilling with the 12.8? Don has proposed 3
And I proposed
into
10.
this recreation trail development. You've termed to say, call it active recreation trail,
Active recreation and river access.
active river
Active recreation and river access,
and river.
maybe and/or river access.
Okay,
Well, as you're working on that, I mean, I'm just,
Yes, O&M is still there.
I'm going to add that you put it into the 1.1 HIA follow-up and not to recreation,
Which one?
which is HIA follow-up, 1.1 million. It's,
Yes.
I would suggest that the, whatever funds we agree is an appropriate amount to shift around gets moved to that line item and not tie it to recreation. And that if that line item then recommends recreation, great, it can still go to recreation, but that it directly responds to the HIA.
It's a good way to govern it.
Yes.
Catherine, are you saying to take that 1.1 and assume that that's available for recreation as well as
No.
other stuff?
So take 12.8 million and put it into plus 1.1 to make it 13.9.
Put that all
Well,
into.
I wasn't setting an
Put that all
amount.
into a health
What I
mitigation
was saying
fund.
is you take whatever amount you feel is appropriate of the 12.8, whether it's all of it or part of it, and you put it into the HIA follow-up, and you let the HIA determine the best use of funds to mitigate the health impacts. And it may be that recreation is recommended through the HIA, it may be other things, or a little rebalancing of all kinds of things.
The reason I'm asking is that I've recently been doing some literature review on pollution mitigation, and in a practical sense for the constructed home park, some of that mitigation has to be large and structural and vegetation. The idea of addressing it all through individual housing mitigations is probably not fully effective. And so depending on what the plans specifically are for sound barrier walls and such along Hayden Island Drive, that can have some real positive impacts on pollution spread. So I like the idea of looking at it as a mitigation package, but I don't want us to lean too far in the strictly recreational direction because there may be some structural and vegetation things that need to be done as well.
I see what you mean.
So the HIA would give us that flexibility then,
Right.
follow
I see
up.
what you mean.
I think that's smart. It localizes the
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we propose an amendment, if we're all agreeing that we want to put it into the HIA, I think the decision is dollars. So Don proposed 3. Chris proposed 10.
Anybody for something in the middle?
Well,
Susan's right,
Yeah.
whatever.
Again, we're kind of pulling stuff out of the air, so.
Yeah,
it's-
Because of our
We're
opinion.
back to that.
Yeah.
Suggested amount?
I mean, I can do 7.5 if that'll help you.
I like something that ends with 0.9, because then it makes
I mean,
This
I
may
don't
be
know.
the extreme position, but I would advocate leaving the whole bundle together.
That's a better idea.
Just because the science around mitigation of the air pollution impacts in particular is really just beginning to emerge. And we don't really know what we're going to be facing several years or 15 years down the line and what the resource needs would be. So that's why I would advocate leaving that chunk of money together. You know, if we decide to make it a lesser amount, it's, you know, these particular amounts came from some very discrete calculations of actual costs for a park. And so they have their own intrinsic rationale. When we convert that to general funding to support health mitigation, we're kind of grabbing that number out of the air, and I recognize that. But there may be a substantial investment that's required to protect the health and well-being of the folks who are living in the manufactured home community there.
I agree with that, and it addresses Don's concern about the nexus. If it's tied into the HIA, you've got that nexus built in.
Right.
Is there the ability to say it's up to 12.8? So in other words, if the health impact analysis came back with, you can completely mitigate for 6 million, let's say, you know, then fine. Just kind of like some of these other ones are ranges. I mean, I don't know, just a
We
thought.
can say up
I
to
love
12.8. We can say
instead of a
12.8.
flat number.
I mean,
I just
especially since now
disagree with the
12.8
flat
has nothing to
number.
do with health impact.
Well,
You know,
we
it's
can,
just a
we
number
have a
that's been shifted.
1.1 number, we can say between 1.1 and 13.9.
Yeah.
That gives us the 12.8.
Susan's struggling.
Nice range.
You may be more likely to trigger the dispute resolution clause if you leave the range too big, I guess.
I was going to say, although we did manage to just draw a line between a bunch of random dots, that doesn't make it less. I guess that's my role here every once in a while, is it doesn't make it less, kind of pulling it out of the air a little bit, because the amounts for the park were based on the need for money to address the building of that park. It doesn't have anything to do with the level of mitigation for health impacts that you might want. Versus the example we had a little bit ago, where we put a dollar cap. We knew what we're trying to get, a certain amount of mitigation at a certain level. We don't know what that is right now. And so in this case, I don't think it's crazy to come up with a specific number that feels reasonable. And I think that's okay. It's a starting point. It's your recommendation, and between now and when this goes to council, if we have additional information, we can provide that to council.
So that would be my comment, would be, just as you had some pretty specific reasons for the 12.8 million for the park, based on something, some calculation you knew, we're not basing this right now on anything we know. We're just pulling out this number because we already have 12.8. So I would like some information as to a smart guess on what I like the idea of the range of numbers, 1.1 to 6 or something like that, so that you don't have to spend a certain amount, but you can go up to a certain amount. But my problem is I don't know what that number should be, and I wouldn't want to vote on it tonight because I don't know what the number should be. I have no information.
But we don't know the health.
To help me.
The other health impact is not going to be done for years down the road. So we don't know what.
There's no kind of projection you can give. There is no best guess. Okay?
Gary?
You know, I think the policy choice of linking it more tightly with the HIA makes a lot of sense. And I think, you know, the work we've done earlier this evening is trying to make things more specific to the actual development, I think is a really positive and rational direction. the challenge is that we don't really know exactly what that's going to look like. And so I don't think by July or August or November, we're going to come up with, rationally designed mitigation packages. So I think at some point we'll need to just estimate, gee, here's some money that should be set aside to promote mitigation.
So could you not rationalize it as, we've moved to 12.8 because it buys a park and maintenance for the park over the long term. And that may be one of the arguments that comes out of the health impact analysis. And that's why we just moved the funds. And that's how you come up with the number.
Another way to address this would be, since the health impact analysis won't be completely defined for a number of years, maybe we leave enough money in here to buy the land. To buy the land.
I'll buy that.
We leave the 3 million in there, which as I look at these numbers is about $25 a square foot. So we're able to tie up land, whether it be linear or whether it be an object site on the river. We leave that in the budget. And then once there's clarity around the health impact analysis, what kind of offset to that impact that this facility could provide, that'll drive the program of the recreational improvement. And then we could apply capital money to this at that
I
point.
like that idea. I like that. Land bank, actually. I
Land
guess.
bank at Howard.
Yeah.
So the key is that there's not a park on the island where people can get to the river.
So
Where does O&M come in
That's
that
massive.
scenario?
Why don't you throw that in?
Well, you're back to a park. I mean, it seems to me, if we can get just the money up at the HIA and add some language that said that, this money was intended for a park, for land purchase, describe what it was intended for, but we want to use it for the best and highest mitigation possible. And if parks is part of that mitigation, it would be our preference. So our intent was a park, but we've moved the money to the HI to mitigate to the highest and best. But if parks are part of that mitigation, that would be if someone has a choice of mitigation, parks is our preference down the road.
For preventative.
For preventative, if that's part of the solution down the road.
So maybe this is my hang-up. I just spent a whole bunch of time in Beijing, and there's no point in being outside. It's unhealthier outside than it is inside. So that's kind of why I'm like, why are we tying this to a park?
Well, we're not. I'm just saying if that's part of the mitigation that someone comes out with, then they know what our preference would be.
Hey, the best mitigation might be a clinic.
Exactly.
Yeah, it might be.
Exactly.
I was just going to say it a little bit differently, actually, Andre, and say the money set aside for health mitigation, one option could be a park.
Yeah.
That's really what we're saying here, and that it doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be.
That's kind of what I would like to support
Okay.
without any specifics to it, to support Don's concern.
So you're saying one option could be a park, and in order to do a park right, we need the 12.8.
Is it 12.8 years down the road?
Well, that's what the estimate that we just
Yeah.
eliminated.
I mean,
was.
that's the purchase and the construction, the capital improvement.
That's in 2012 dollars, so it'd be
Yeah, I was
different
gonna say
depending
that's-
on what the rate of
Whatever
inflation.
the
Yeah, well, how do
rate,
you know
yeah.
what that's gonna be? Well, because you said the HIA could maybe be for years and years from now.
From a staff
12.8 might not work.
thought, I would offer two other places in this equation where we've done similar kind of logic, from two different ends of the spectrum. One is on the housing grant piece where we had some logic to coming up with 3.6 million, which was essentially a third of what we expected the total need to be, assuming some matches. So that was an example where we had a program that was roughly sketched out and we came up with a number based on some rationale. On the other end of the spectrum, the current 1.1 million for HIA follow-up was simply around $1 million number plus the cost of the HIA itself. So that was on the other end of the spectrum. It was a much more negotiated number. So we've done both already in the draft agreement.
We need to move forward. So the proposal,
It sounds like you've got a range between adding 1.1 plus the 3, so that'd be 4.1, all the way up to the 12.8 plus 1.1, so 13 points. So 4 to 14. And I think you could rationalize or make a case for
Okay.
that some level of cost sharing is needed or desired for the park or other mitigation things, if you want to go to a lower number, and if you want the port to pay more of the full cost, then you would go for the higher number.
Okay. So 4 to 14.
And that range is not going to be a range that's going to encourage people to not sign it? You just said that there was another number that was a range that you said, well, it's not a good range.
No, I think, I would encourage you to pick one number, not to do a range here. I think that just leaves it to, council's asking for your best advice, and so we're any place where you can settle near a number, I would encourage you to do that, to show that you had some general agreement on everything, because you don't want several of these amendments to be big, broad ranges. That doesn't help them as much.
Chris?
Up to something. So, I'll tell you that I haven't figured out how I'm voting on the overall package yet, but one of my concerns is that we don't have enough capability to deal with the human health impacts. So having the whole 12.8 plus 1.1 available down the road for what the HIA tells us will make it easier for me to vote for the overall package in the end. So I'd be inclined to put it all in there for now.
Put a number on that, 4 to 14. is that
So
what you're saying?
make a motion.
Yeah.
So
Because we need
I
to move
move
this
that,
along.
so I move that we increase the HIA reserve fund, is that the right term of art? Eric will tell me the term of art, to the HIA follow-up fund to 13.9 million.
Second.
Discussion?
Is it, so if we put, we put that amount, I'm not resisting this idea, Chris, because, I think it gives us the ability to form a connection between our impacts and how we're funding mitigation. I think I like that. That's an improvement. Would there be some flexibility built in the future, in your mind, about how that is spent? Whether recreation facilities are the right choice, et cetera?
Well, in that language, it just says whatever the HIA tells us we should be doing.
Right.
And if it's HIA, there's a good opportunity for local input. I think that's better.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's
that's-
implicit that it's attached to HIA. I wouldn't have thought it any other way.
Howard?
Would you?
Let's see what Gary, just hold on a second.
I mean, the HIA intrinsically involves community involvement. I mean, that's a fundamental component, but I would assume that also that the ongoing advisory committee would also weigh in on this process, but maybe do I have that right?
Correct. The
That's
way
important
that
to me.
plays out is
Yeah.
the advisory committee has a role. I mean, the dispute, if there was a dispute, it would arise over whether, if you gauge the impact from that process and there's a disagreement about whether it really represents that full 12 million, or whether the mitigation then is scaled back if there was a lesser impact determined. That's where I can imagine there being an argument. In other words, are you putting a fixed amount on the table, or does that get to be negotiated down if the impacts are deemed to be less in the future?
Can you put in language that says that?
That's your policy decision, I
Right,
guess.
well, I think,
Well, I'm just asking, can you could you say that then? Because that's my problem, is that would stop me from saying yes, is what if it isn't $14 million? What if it is less? I mean, you have to allow for that fact that it could be. And so being able to put in something that says you're able to not have it be that amount if it isn't that amount would be important to me. That's why I like the range. But you're saying don't put in a range, but I would want to have something in there that says maybe that isn't going to happen.
Couldn't
If I
up
would-
to work as a,
I think up to works, but I'm not hearing that that's. what-
something more like available if needed. Right.
well, up to really
I like
gives
up
you
to.
Up to invites a negotiation.
Yeah.
that's what I think they
Yes,
want.
which is the idea.
Not a
We're
bad
not
idea.
saying you shouldn't spend money you don't need, but if there's legitimate need, the fund should be available.
I mean,
Exactly.
haven't we said as determined by the HIA,
Yes.
right?
So
Doesn't
HIA
that,
could be allowed to say you need less, right?
But Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but an HI wouldn't typically monetize to that level of detail.
No,
No, it wouldn't.
wouldn't tell you what to do.
No, it probably wouldn't monetize it, but I think it may come up with some priorities in terms of what would be most effective investment. So for example, is a particular type of ventilation, freestanding ventilation unit for each home an appropriate thing? Are windows appropriate? Is some vegetation enhancement along North Hayden Island Drive likely to be effective? So I think you can, at some point, that stuff will get monetized and prioritized. But the assessment itself, you're right, I don't think we'll say, here's exactly what should be done.
This just doesn't have a lot of definition.
Just reading the language here, the public involvement in the operation of the fund, so there is public involvement, and then 6.52 talks about the appropriate uses for the fund based on the results of the assessment. So whatever the results are, the appropriate use of the funds will be applied.
What page are you on, Andre?
It's 133. And then it talks about the initial funding for the housing fund. I'm sorry, this is for the housing fund.
Where's the 1.1 million called out today?
It's HIA follow-up.
HIA follow-up.
Yeah, it's,
Where's it carved out?
It's at the bottom of page 132, section 6.4.3.
Right here it is.
Yeah, okay.
So
The language is, the port will consult with the advisory committee as the
As
port
described.
establishes and manages this fund. Right,
So I think there is, the port is managing the fund in cooperation with the advisory committee.
so my amendment would be that 1 million changes to 13.8.
That's what we had. Any other
the language,
discussion?
you want the language to read up to 13.8.
And it's
Not
13.9.
required to spend that.
13.9.
0.9.
What's
So
that,
do you
up
want to
to,
amend
but
the
not-
I
amendment,
would say
Karen,
up to.
Yeah.
Yes,
to up to 13.9?
yes, I'd like to
Okay.
see a cap on it.
Okay, up to 13.9.
No, it's 13.8 because the 100,000 is called out separately.
Right,
Okay, 13.
Keep our bookkeeping straight.
yeah, 100 here, 100 there.
Get real money.
Pretty soon.
So
it's
Okay.
all
Was that a friendly amendment?
All this.
So you're
I seconded his.
Yeah, I'll take up to if that's what's going to take to get
up
this thing
to,
through.
okay. The amendment is that the 12.8 be moved to the HIA up to $13.8 million.
That's right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's correct.
It's been moved and seconded and amended. Julie, any other discussion? Julie, vote.
Gray,
Yes,
Hanson,
Yes.
Hope,
Yes.
Oxman,
Yes.
Schultz,
Yes.
Shapiro,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Bach.
Yes. And now, if you have, since we've done all the ones that are prescribed, if you have any additional amendments, it's the time and we'll just go around the room.
I've been doing this for 3 years.
Gary, do you have any additional amendments? Do you have any additional amendments you'd like to propose?
So I have 4 items. I don't know that amendments is the right term, but things I'd like to see us do before we end this meeting. We should talk a little bit about what happens if the CRC doesn't happen in the next, if it becomes dead in between now and our vote on July 9th.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Thanks, Chris.
There's a staff comment, not in section 1, but elsewhere in the responses, it says it's premature to designate the third party for the IGA. I don't understand why it's premature, and I'd like to talk about that. I was expecting that somebody was going to raise an issue around the sort of strength of the requirements for air quality management projects, and nobody has. So I'm just reminding the people who told me privately they wanted to talk about that, if they want to bring that up.
You're
this is a good
referencing
time.
like testing requirements, monitoring
Yeah, more
requirements?
things like, the types of diesel locomotives and shore power and those kind of things. So maybe the language we have is adequate, but I thought I was going to hear somebody bring that up. And then, this may be more like a section 5, but I think we should talk about what the structure of the votes we're going to take on July 9th is likely to be, because there have been a number of one-on-one conversations, a conversation with staff about how many votes in what order. I think we should be clear among ourselves, and we should also give the public some indication what's going to happen. So that probably should go at the end. I would
That'll
think.
be the end.
So those are my four. And air quality is only important if somebody else wants to raise it, because I'm not the expert on that piece. So I don't know what
Who is that person?
We'll see, Howard, do you have anything?
No, I don't.
No.
Mike? I have two. I would like to talk about air quality, and I would like to talk about MOU of funding requirements.
MOU, a funding requirement?
Yeah, I would like, it, to me, there is an absolute need that not only the port, but the city at Metro at a minimum, and probably the state economic development side of it, as partners, go after funding to fund this project. And I think, I can't speak for Metro, but I think, they're in a kind of a quandary of, this is a facility that they want, but at the same time, it's expensive, and then there's no doubt that it's expensive. I mean, even at the cheapest end is still a $100 million project, and you can argue the cost one way or the other, but if we're gonna do the right thing on the island, you need federal, state support. And to do that, you should have all the partners that are in that, Metro, the county, the state, everybody making that appeal for additional funds at the federal level and at the state level for those funds. And it should be a partnership, and there should be an MOU that comes out of this that we're all gonna go chase funds, because if the business plan doesn't figure out how to build it, you're not gonna get the development. And whether or not you need it or not is a different question, but you do need funding. And we're saying this is the right way to do it. If it is, then all the partners that have a skin in the game, from the state to the county to Metro to the city and the port, should go after it. So it's just a proposal.
So is that a recommendation our commission makes to council, Andre? Is that how you would see it?
No, and I actually think it is part of the IGA that they enter an MOU with the city and the county and everybody, that there be somebody that, probably the city, that leads that MOU process to create a MOU to create that, to get everybody on board.
I don't know if this is the right time to start having the discussion, but do you see that as linked to the business planning process?
I do, because the business plan is just going to say you need to go chase money, I think, at the end of the day. But we need to say, yeah, we recognize that before you get to the business plan, and we need someone to go out and start doing that as partners today. And I just want to set that course, that someone's got to take that charge. So those are my two. Don, do you have some?
No, I think these are good. This is a good list.
Karen?
No.
So let's start at the top and go with Chris, CRC.
So I've had this conversation individually with Eric, but I think it'd be good for the commission to hear it. So if the Washington legislature takes definitive action, doesn't fund the CRC the next month, it would be hard to count on the CRC as the IGA contemplates. What would then happen to this process, Eric, if that happened?
I think there's a couple implications. One is, goes to the timing of when council might choose to vote. And at the moment, there are members of council who would not take this up until the CRC question is resolved. So it really, part of it gets to your comfort level as a commission with whether the council would, how the council would handle that. A second piece is how the city would resolve the planning issues that arise with not having a CRC bridge. And that process, as I see it, would inevitably kind of land in the transportation system plan update that PBOT is leading now. And it would also kind of play out in the comprehensive plan process. So, I think it would, that doesn't answer what you do about Hayden Island in the short term if that plays out that way, but it does answer sort of how the city would deal with it, I think.
So I mean, I don't have an amendment to propose, but I want everybody to be aware that, there is this wild card that screw things up.
I mean, we essentially have a timeline answer to you right now, is that we would have to go figure that out before bringing it to a vote at council.
Well, I guess the question would it be worth us voting on July 9th if the CRC were dead between now and then? I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Well, I sure hope we do. I mean, no, really, I don't think, I see that they're tied, Chris, and I understand your anxiety, but we've been working at this for 6, 8 months, whether there's gonna be a bridge to the River Kwai. I mean, it was, really, I think we owe council what they asked us to do. Come and tell them what we think that should happen here. I think the implications of the CRC are profound and not incidental, but I don't think they should deter us from taking a vote and moving forward.
Right, but some pieces of this package just won't work anymore.
That's the way it works, right? I mean, that's the way things happen.
Well, taking a vote could be any number of things.
Yeah.
Right, so we
Including,
might want to say something about
we think-
expectations of how those things get addressed, yeah.
Don?
If the CRC doesn't go ahead, does the traffic system fail on the island if this development occurs?
It's not related to whether this development occurs, but,
But yes, it fails.
Because we're 12% of 12 to 22% of the traffic volume.
yeah, but our understanding is that it whether this development goes forward isn't the cause of the failure.
Okay, thank you. Sure wouldn't help, though.
No, but
Yes, it's not a good
it's
thing,
not
but
what
I'm
causes
just-
you to go over the edge. We would have to rethink what you've already done with the Hayden Island plan, potentially. That, we don't know yet, but that's one of the
So all
options.
that zoning would be called into question.
Or we would have to look through the TSP at what other, improvements are still in the cards for that area. You could, this is just me talking, not a complete analysis of that, but you'd look at the different projects that we have in the TSP already for that area and try and figure out what the right.
Stitch something together, yeah.
Okay. Other comments on CRC?
It's real encouraging.
Good news.
After that mistrial, what will we?
Wow. No, Chris, I'm glad you brought that up.
Staff comments on third-party IGA?
The reason we said that it's premature is it's kind of an inherently negotiated thing if it's going to be in an IGA, and so it's difficult for this commission to name a party and have that stick. That's just my feeling, because ultimately the city and port will have to agree on it to sign the IGA. It feels a little bit like a detail that we can't nail down right now, but you can recommend something if you want.
So I guess I'd like to throw an idea out for consideration. Audubon has put in their letter that they're volunteering. I think other people have referenced that the tribes might fit very well in that function if they're willing, and we don't know if they're willing. So would it make any sense for this commission to recommend that those be two potential candidates for the third-party role in the IGA, or shall we just leave that to city council later on?
Well, I would be willing to recommend someone if they're willing to be recommended.
Right. We don't.
And so we don't know that about the tribe, so I'm unwilling to.
Yeah, we should give them a ring.
Yeah. So I would rather leave that. I mean, I'm willing to recommend, but I don't want to recommend someone if they're not in the mood.
Right, but I guess
could
this
be a
is
such
an important
as.
thing for us to weigh in on. Does the commission think that we should weigh in on this choice? Let me ask the question that way.
So Chris, you're saying it would be like, you profile an organization that makes sense, and then you say such as Audubon or the tribes.
Within our role to make that suggestion too.
Yeah, I think that's,
I have no resistance to that.
no. So can we do it as a such as, Eric?
Sure.
You can do whatever, yeah.
Two wonderful words.
Just to be clear, though, what you're talking about is the third party related to the open space, the agreement not to seek rezoning in the future of the open space. There's a piece that said we'd put a covenant in place with a third party on that. Is that what you're talking about?
So what section are we amending here?
That's in continuing obligations 11.1.2,
Page number?
Page number?
page 138. It was designed to put some additional constraints on our ability to unilaterally rezone the property to other uses. 11.1.2.
Okay, so we would amend that.
You could, you could also accomplish that simply in your transmittal letter if you wanted to not amend it, but that's,
I think that would be the most appropriate place for it. Would be
I
the
vote for
transmittal
Transmittal letter, okay. Done. So we will put that in our transmittal letter. Everybody okay with that? We're not gonna vote on that. Air quality. Air quality.
Otherwise, we'd have to wait for Howard.
Yeah. No, we've got 6. We're good.
He asked us.
Oh, okay. Air quality, my concern is that part of the HIA is going to look at the trucks and the condition of the trucks and the amount of air pollution, the trains and the ships. We know today with certain standards, the trucks can be almost zero, the trains can be almost zero, and the ships can be significantly reduced or zero at dock through current technology that is either available or going to be mandated by the EPA in 2015 through the engines that are required to be produced. And so there's language in there that kind of gets to that, but it seems that it's not as we're going to let the HIA, to me, kind of say, you have to do it. And I'd rather, we know the technology's there, be more specific about having that as part of the HIA takes into consideration so you don't have to turn around and talk about mitigation and chasing going forward.
the place in the current agreement
Yes.
that gets closest to that is the part that references the attachment G, which
G,
is
yes.
the port sustainability policy statement
what I
and
Yep.
the
actually
green
read that.
performance goals that are attached. So are
And
you
so-
asking for something more specific in there?
Yeah, and I appreciate the port, what they're trying to get to, and this goes back to a long conversation, a long time ago, that talked to the port, and they brought that forward. And I appreciate that. I think just getting more specific, that we get to that sooner than later, gives the HIA, I think, a better shot at having less mitigation of trying to get to lower emission engines just right off the bat versus,
Do you want to, I could see two ways of doing this. Do you want to amend the IGA specifically, or are you essentially saying to the port, go back and propose something more specific and bring us back another copy of attachment G before your final vote? And then I guess you can choose to vote for it or not, depending on whether they've satisfied. I guess, how specific are you wanting us to be as the city staff on this? Do you want to put that question in the port's hands
I
to
would like it to be from the port, but at the same time, I understand the importance is that we have the technology today, and we know the technology is available. So I'm struggling with whether or not mandate it through an IGA, say, we do that we have a voluntary compliance.
I guess if I was to weigh in, I'd say, let's get the port to see if they'll voluntarily comply first,
Okay.
and then talk about it myself. And kind of because I think just like you're saying, it will be covered in the HIA, whether it gets covered there or not. So you still have kind of your backstop. So let's see what they'll come back with, and then, like I said, I would tend to let myself, the HIA, take it from there.
And specifically on page 177, that's probably the place where some of the content of the attachment G gets closest to covering that topic right now, under air and energy.
Yes.
So one of the things, I just checked with the city attorney here, was if you bring back the attachment G and it's something you're uncertain with, you want to play with it a little tiny bit, we can still do amendments. I'm not encouraging this, but on the 9th And you're not city council where you can't do an amendment, vote on it, and it becomes a rule, you have to wait again another week. Here you could actually make a small amendment like that and vote on it, and it would still count, and you wouldn't have to come back for another vote.
So my request would be that we ask the port to achieve those numbers before we get to the HIA.
So you're asking them to more specifically define the emissions-related air
Emissions,
quality
yes,
targets?
yes. Specifically for the trucks, which we know if they put 2015 engines in and they're doing 2025 development, that there's virtually no emissions. So we don't have to deal with that. We know the locomotives, we can get there and we know we can at least plug in a ship, and there's probably going to be better technology by that time, but at least require that. And then if there's better technology, because right now they're talking about electrification, putting in the infrastructure. But if you can't, I mean, that's great, but I'd like to have them actually say plug in or better for the emission, because plug in is zero.
That'll help our HIA.
Yeah,
I come back to the park budget.
yeah, exactly. That's where I'm kind of getting to, because we can help.
where the emissions are.
We just,
Emissions are somewhere else.
I mean, it does, they're still happening.
no, the
You're
port,
plugging into the grid.
the port is committing to buying all the power from renewable resources.
Okay.
So I think
Windmills
there's.
that wipe out.
Okay.
Sorry.
Where are we going? So I just would like to make that request, and then we'll see on July 9th what we get to.
Okay.
Does that cover both of the air quality questions?
Well, that was my air quality
Or there were
question.
two air quality questions? One
I was
Chris had.
reminding Andre that he was
Yeah,
supposed to bring
he was reminding me,
Backing
and
each other up.
I was,
Right on.
I had it right here.
Very thoughtful.
The other one is, as I discussed before, is to have a provision in the IGA that puts the city on responsibility to create and says the port will be agreeable to entering into a memorandum of understanding to seek additional funding for this project, and the named potential members being Metro and Multnomah County
state.
and the state.
Fed? Federal?
It's a good idea. They're gonna need to do
You
it.
didn't call them
Gotta
out.
work
These
on
are
it.
these are the identifiable resources.
These
that
are
we need.
and identifiable being state and federal resources, and could be PBA, could be a partner in that, in seeking, and because there's, they're supportive of the West Hayden Island, and if they want the jobs, there's good reason to be supportive of seeking funding.
And so to make sure I understand what you're proposing, that would be presumably an added sentence or two in the business planning
The business plan.
clause, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's good.
So they're entering into a memorandum of understanding.
They're agreeable to entering in, they're gonna agree to, when they sign the AJ, to agree to enter into a memorandum of understanding to seek funding, additional funding for the project
Okay, and their MOU is gonna be
with the city of Portland, Metro, the county,
Okay.
the state development agency.
It says they won't fight it.
Yeah, they're not gonna fight being in a partnership to seek funding.
Okay,
That's what I,
okay.
Right, well, I mean, I think this is a really critical issue, because, I mean, we're up here as the port is telling us they can't afford to do all this, and I think we're not necessarily arguing that the port's revenue stream could fund all this, although the BAE memo does say there's lots of variability, and it's not impossible, but we're kind of doing this differently post-Portland plan, right? In the past, we would have accepted some level of community impacts, environmental impacts to make the business proposition work. And we're pretty much here drawing the line saying we're not going to accept that. We're going to require that the community and the environment be made whole, and there are costs associated with that. We can't see how the port's business plan covers all those costs, so we're saying go find some more money, because there are other people who have an interest in making sure that we can achieve these objectives, including Metro, including the state.
Yeah.
Want to see this port built, also, are, I think, generally supportive of the Portland Plan values, so, let's everybody link hands here and say we're gonna do this together, because otherwise it's not gonna happen, right? So this is kind of a manifesto for how you make this kind of project work in the future.
So is there a second?
Second. Was I the mover? I don't know. You were the mover, right?
Discussion? Julie, vote.
Gray,
Yes.
Hanson,
Yes.
Hout,
Sure.
Oxman, Schultz,
Yes.
Shapiro.
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Baugh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any last amendments? That was the last one I had. Eric, do you have any more?
No, so the proposal, the process going forward is, and we got to get to your structure of the vote question, but the
Yes.
staff process going forward is we'll take this amendment list and bring back to you our version of what the actual language in the IGA and the code looks like from all these amendments. As you said, that you could still reserve the right to do one last on-the-spot amendment if you so choose, but that'll be up to you. And then the discussion with the commission leadership was this idea of a two-vote structure. So that's the next topic.
So the vote that we've talked about is actually having two votes. One would be a yes, no, and that would be on the annexation of West Hayden Island. That's not what we just discussed, spent the last 2.5 hours discussing, but that's just on the annexation question, yes or no. And the next question that would be before us is the plan, the West Hayden Island project plan,
The district plan?
the district plan that we discussed. And so we would have two votes going to council, one on annexation, the other one on basically the IGA and the other parts.
I'd phrase it a little differently, so it's
Yeah.
two parts. One part is this a good idea or not, right? This whole idea of annexing West Hayden Island. The other is, if you're gonna do it, how should we do it? Sort of two separate questions, because we'll have a recommendation, council may or may not follow a recommendation. Even if they don't follow a recommendation on the do it or not, I think we'd like them to follow a recommendation on the way to do it well, right? So that's the motivation for splitting the votes.
Howard?
I guess
This
I'm
is
splitting
discussion
it
on
into
the
hairs
idea.
here. I would say it differently, I guess. I would say, well, I really wouldn't
Well, that's why
say it
we're having the
differently.
discussion.
No, I would say it in a little different format. I would say, I could support annexation if, and the if would be the conditions of the amendments. If all those amendments passed, I could support annexation.
There are two distinct
questions. And so
I would vote for
let's have a little
annexation.
discussion about, because it's going to be critical how we frame the questions.
Right.
And I want to hear how we're thinking about it in terms of question.
I think Chris expressed it perfectly. There's the question of, is this a good idea? Vote on annexation, and then depending on how that vote comes out, then we can talk about how well it's being done.
I think you need to talk about how well it's being done either way, right?
Well, true.
I even wonder if we shouldn't vote
Yeah,
the other
well-
order, right?
But might I vote against it because I don't like the format of the way it's coming down?
Well, I guess my hope
One
would
staff
be
clarification.
format.
The yes, no, is this a good idea is clear. Just to be clear about, if you're going to do it, this is how, there are subcomponents to that. This is how, which include the code, the plan district and the zoning code, which is what you typically have the formal authority to pass on a recommendation. And then there's the IGA, which essentially you're making a recommendation to council that goes beyond the normal sort of planning and zoning role you play, but that's still part of your, if you're going to do it, here's what we recommend.
We have a statutory role in recommending annexations.
No, there's,
There's no history. There's no history.
not on an individual level. You were responsible for amending the codes originally that provided this process, but
But there's lots of actions that you take up here that aren't statutory, whether it's commenting on transportation or parks or housing.
Don?
Well, I think with annexation, you have to have the zoning. You know, we're annexing, it's coming into the city, it's coming in as what? It's coming in as 300 acres of industrial and 500 acres of open space. So I think annexation and zoning need to travel together. And I would also say probably the district plan needs to follow that too. Then the IGA is a recommendation, as I understand it, right?
Well, they're all recommendations. And to be clear, we weren't bundling the zoning with, the yes-no was simply the yes-no. The bundle, the second vote bundle, what we were recommending was the zoning and the IGA as two separate components, recognizing that you have more typical authority over the zoning, but you're still making a recommendation on both.
So it's one vote on should it come in or not.
Yes.
Second vote on zoning, the district plan, and the IGA.
And it's all recommendation, because that's,
Yeah.
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 It's all a recommendation.
Sorry. Chris?
Well, I just point out that, you know, we have the statutory responsibility to make a recommendation on zoning, right? But the council also set up this resolution that essentially said, tell us how to do 300, 500, right?
Yeah,
And
we've
that's,
defined it.
yeah, so that's really the two questions. You can group them slightly different ways. Let me suggest another idea, and I don't know if this will have any traction or not, but, you know, I know from talking to people on this commission that there are yes partisans and there are no partisans. There are a lot of us in the middle trying to figure out how we're going to vote. I'm wondering if it would help to have two motions framed in advance. One for the yes with the best arguments for why we should do this, and another with the no and the best arguments for why we shouldn't. So we have both of those in front of us as we're trying to debate. I don't know if that's useful or if we should just come into the room and hash it out and make it up as we go along on that, but I'm interested in other people's thoughts on that. People are looking at me skeptically, so maybe that's not the greatest idea.
well, we,
From
a staff,
Taking away our spontaneity.
I think we need to lighten up and.
Well, I think framing it, framing it is.
I would
framing is a
like
good
to at least frame the yes/no question. I think Chris is framed, and a lot of people's. I think the IGA and the code seems to me to be, no matter how you vote on the annexation question, is more of a question. If you're going to do this, this is how you ought to do it.
Yeah.
Here's our
Right.
best thoughts
Yeah,
of how
that
to
was
do
my-
it.
Yeah, I think
And
we
that
worked very
really
hard here
is,
tonight to get
Yeah.
that's our
Yeah.
best recommendation to you of how to do it
That's it, I
and,
agree.
and why to do it and all that. The other question is, it's not a, even though we're saying it's a yes or no, it's not a yes or no question, at least to me. And so it's a more complex question, and how we frame that question will be not only important to us, but it'll also be important to council of how we framed the annexation question. Because the other question, I think we've more than adequately answered. This is the best way to do it, and we've had a lot of input from the citizens and community about it.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding this because I've never done this before, but to me, the first question is whether or not you're gonna walk through the door at all. So to me, it is a yes or no on annexation. If we all vote no and we recommend no, I think you're done, the door is shut, we said no. I mean, they could go yes. You know what I mean? But isn't like the first vote whether you're gonna open the door or not?
Well, Chris has a different view. He thinks you ought to vote on the other one first, and then ask the question.
Let's
Yes.
follow your example and we say
Yeah.
no, right?
Right.
So it goes to council and they say
Right.
yes.
Mhm.
Do you want them to make up their own plan for how to do it, or you want them to follow our plan? Right.
No, I think
Right.
you'd still vote.
Which is why I would still want us to endorse a plan for how you do it, even if we recommend not doing it. Right.
I'm just thinking, I'm framing it in my own head. Yes, eventually I would certainly want to, if they overturned our recommendation and said yes anyway, I certainly would want to say in it, since we've all spent so many years talking about it, and make a recommendation, yeah.
We
I'm
won't
just
get to make
thinking
recommendations then. We have to do it now.
No, I know that.
so typically with anything like this, we would draft up sort of a script of what the motion is. So that we can certainly do that
I think
and
that's
work
what
with
And
it.
that would,
That's what, yeah.
that would frame it, if you could provide that framing.
So if you have, I guess I would suggest this to anybody, if you have language about how to frame the annexation question. If you can get that to Julie, just even if it's not a complete sentence, but what the intent you're trying to, you think we're voting on the annexation question, because that's critical. And I think the other one's pretty straightforward,
Oh,
but.
I'm gonna come up with something different.
Well, but I think we have then something for staff to start thinking about our thoughts of how we think about it in terms of that question.
Okay, this might be a stupid question, but there are no stupid questions, right? So if you took the vote of, let's say, I'm totally 100% for annexation, but I want it to be park. I want Portland to annex it and make the whole thing a park. Is that kind of what that's getting at by asking that question? Because I could say yes to annexation, but
Yes.
no to the proposal.
Yes.
Okay.
You can vote yes, no, no, yes, there's,
Intriguing thought.
yeah.
I think you should have offered an amendment to the zoning.
So sorry, I put it out there.
They're independent votes.
Yeah, right.
They're independent votes, and the idea is that, in thinking about this, that probably one's a little more visceral than the other.
So,
Visceral.
so I
Yes.
have a different idea, and this may also be kind of silly, but I know for me, when it comes time for me to vote on the annexation, yes or no, I'm gonna have something to say about it.
Yeah.
So this isn't a vote where I'm gonna go, yes, and hope that it's over, or no, and hope, I'm gonna have something to say about it. So I wanna know if that's okay. I don't mean a treatise, but I certainly will have something to say.
Of course. Yes. My desire is that we have, that really is your night for comments about this process, about what you think we're going to vote on, and how you feel and what you feel, so that we have a collective of everybody's feelings about the last 2.5 years or 3 years we've been through.
But you want us to also provide staff with.
How you think about that first vote, whether or not the yes or no annexation, how you would frame it in your mind.
Okay.
And you don't have to, I'm just trying to get what's our collective thinking about that question.
So are they taking, let's say 5 people choose to do that, however?
I don't know what the process is going to be.
We'll do what we always do is we'll just, no, we'll come back with a response, and you'll have the opportunity to frame the question
Pick it like you
here.
picked the other duck.
All right.
No,
And so it's our intention to vote on this on July 9th.
Yes.
Okay.
and when you do that, I mean, this is being taped, obviously. Council will have the opportunity to listen to each of your comments, so I do think your comments are really, really important, you know, as Don said, in terms of the process, in terms of the incredible amount of community involvement and participation and all the hours you've spent on this. And I think that it's important that you think about, you know, what you're going to say. And Julie will then also summarize each person's comments so that council can have that when they're looking at the decision in case they don't watch the tape.
Howard.
The business of to be or not to be, annex or not annex, I understand that, but I also want to respond to what the council asked us to do. They gave us a specific charge. I think we have to respond to that charge, and the charge isn't should you annex or not, it's should you annex for the purpose of the port developing a facility. I may be all over annexing to turn it into a park or Disneyland or any number of things. So I could vote for the annex and say none of the amendments were for me. I'm not sure that's what we're giving council as a way of an
Well,
answer.
we're giving council on the second vote the question to an answer to their question or recommendation of saying, you asked us about 300, 500 of port development. Here's either we're recommending yes or no, and here's our best advice
That
on
makes sense
how what you asked us to evaluate and do, you should do.
Okay.
So we're
responding to their charge to us.
on the second vote, we're responding to their charge to us about 300 and 500. If you do it, here's how you should do it.
That's the only charge we should be responding to, is their
Well, we have to do the annexation.
I understand,
correct?
it seems to me that what we would do is say, here's what you asked us to do, here's what we're coming back with.
Do we have to vote on annexation?
You don't have to vote on the
Vote on the zoning.
annexation. I think when we met and talked about this earlier, it gave people an opportunity to more clearly define how they were feeling about it so that they could say yes or no to annexation and have the kind of statement that I think both of you were saying, which was, I would vote potentially no, but if you're going to do it, here's how I would do it. Or you could say it the other way around. I'd vote yes on annexation, but I don't like this proposal. It
But
gives you
there's
a
no
little bit more choice.
statutory reason
But you
that we
don't
have to.
have to do that.
Okay,
It's all recommendation.
okay.
I would say, if you want it to be Disneyland, yeah, Howard, if you want it to be Disneyland, you should have put amendments in the package.
Yeah.
tonight.
Yeah, you're a little late.
It's not too late, Chris.
Well, it says marine terminal development in there.
I'm with you, Howard.
Yeah,
So-
Okay.
Like
Okay.
the Ferris wheel idea?
So, Mike, let's wrap this up. Mike.
Well, I just find it hard to imagine we're not gonna vote on annexation or not. We're just gonna go around and say how we feel. I don't get that.
We were supposed to vote on it.
Of course.
I never doubted it, but I do want to be respectful or mindful of what we gotta come back and tell them we did, right?
I think we're doing it.
Gotta do it.
Yeah, we,
Spent 3 hours figuring out the best way to do it.
No, you felt your best way to do it. I just may not agree.
Those votes have priorities on them.
So does everyone understand what the vote's going to look like on
So when is our
July
next
9th?
meeting?
July
June 11th.
July 9th is the
11th
vote
our next-
for, I'm going to be,
our retreat.
okay,
Where is the retreat?
just a second.
Disneyland.
So I want to close this before we move on to the retreat. So July 9th will be our vote on West Hayden Island
Yes.
here.
Be there.
Is that correct, Julie? Yes.
Afternoon or
So,
evening?
real quick before you
Afternoon,
close.
it's at 12:30.
12:30.
And so July 9th, 12:30, we will have a vote. You will have time to make comments about the process, the community involvement, the port involvement, the city involvement, whatever, and then we will take a vote. And we will take 2 votes. And hopefully we will have your input on the language.
The staff, next draft from staff, looking at the calendar, I think we had set internally the deadline of 3 weeks ahead of your July 9th. So that would be on June 18th is our target for getting you essentially a cleaned up version of what we all just talked about.
Okay.
Andre, and
Yes.
you can tell me it's closed and I can't ask this question. I'm just curious. After what you were talking about with changing the port's language about to basically zero emissions,
Yeah.
does the community benefit grant then make sense? Is that not offsetting emissions? So I'm just kind of curious.
It's also noise
And maybe I'm
vibration.
bringing up something I can't bring up anymore because we've kind of closed, but it just seems like they're tied together.
They are, but I don't know if the port's going to change their language.
And
Well,
there's still
so I guess
noise.
that's what I'm saying. So if the port agreed to that, do you give them that option to pull that off the table, the 1.4 million on the community benefit grant to offset
We'll
emissions?
address that on July 9th.
Okay.
You still have noise, vibration, and traffic to mitigate.
Yeah.
And maybe that's exactly the answer. I'm just
Okay.
curious. Okay, thank you.
All right, we're closed on that. Karen, did you have another comment?
I didn't.
Oh, I thought you,
No, I just want to know about the retreat, but I can get an email about that.
okay.
It's in my book.
June
I'll be
11th?
there.
What
June
time?
11th.
June 11th.
Okay, we
time's the
are
retreat?
adjourned, and the retreat is at 10 o'clock on June 11th, 10 to 3.
10 to 3. Where at though?
I don't know that.
Where at?